Imagine you are a child in a small village in central France. It is the 10th of June 1944. Outside, the apple trees are in bloom. The air smells of damp earth and freshly baked bread. That morning, your mother told you that armed men had arrived in the village. Soldiers. Many soldiers. With their armoured vehicles, their black and grey uniforms, their rune-shaped insignias. You don't know what they want. You don't know why they are here. You only know that your mother is squeezing your hand with a strength she has never used before, and that in her eyes there is something you have never seen, a pure, absolute fear that needs no words to express itself. Before that day ended, 642 people in that village had died. 642. Among them, 247 children. The village was called Oradour-sur-Glane, and what happened there remains one of the most documented and most disturbing massacres committed on European soil during the Second World War. And those responsible were not an uncontrolled horde of soldiers drunk on rage. They were members of a specific unit, trained, disciplined in their own way, and deeply ideologized. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, known throughout Europe simply as Das Reich. Before you settle in, take a moment to give the video a good like and subscribe. And tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who joins us from all over the world. Now, the question we are going to explore today is not merely what they did in Oradour-sur-Glane. Many people already know that. The real question, the one very few dare to answer honestly, is this. How did a military unit become a machine of systematic destruction against defenseless civilians? What process transformed those soldiers into what they were? Who were their leaders? What ideology drove them? And why specifically was France the stage where Das Reich showed its darkest face? Because if you think the answer is simply they were Nazis and the Nazis were evil, you are settling for the most superficial version of a story that is much more complicated, much darker, and, in a sense, much more disturbing than any war movie you have ever seen. The story of Das Reich is the story of how an institution can take human beings and turn them into something different. It is the story of how ideology, indoctrination, progressive brutality, and a culture of impunity can create conditions in which the unimaginable becomes routine. And it is also the story of how that process occurred right in the middle of Europe, right in the 20th century, before the eyes of many who preferred not to look. We are going to trace that history from the beginning. And the beginning is not in France in 1944. The beginning is in the most tumultuous years of the Weimar Republic, in the alleys of Munich and Berlin, in the barracks where a new conception of what it meant to be a soldier under the banner of the Third Reich was forged. To understand Das Reich, first you must understand the SS. And to understand the SS, you must go back to a moment that many historians consider the turning point that changed everything. The year was 1929. Germany was plunged into a crisis that went far beyond economics. The defeat in the First World War had left a deep scar on the German collective soul. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, had imposed devastating conditions on the country, loss of territories, severe military restrictions, and above all, the so-called War Guilt Clause, which forced Germany to accept all responsibility for the conflict. The economic reparations were crushing. The inflation of the early 20s had destroyed the savings of millions of families. And when the Great Depression hit, unemployment skyrocketed to figures that today seem almost incomprehensible. In 1932, more than 6 million Germans were out of work. In that context of despair and resentment, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, found fertile ground. And within the party, a specific organisation was growing in a way that few imagined would ever have global consequences. The Schutzstaffel, the SS, had been born in 1925 as a small personal bodyguard corps for Adolf Hitler. In their early years, they were little more than a group of thugs in uniforms. But in 1929, someone arrived who saw enormous potential in that organisation, Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was a peculiar man, Physically unimposing, with round glasses and a thin moustache, he looked more like an accountant or a schoolteacher than the leader of what would become one of the most powerful and feared organizations in modern history. But Himmler had vision, he had obsessions, and he had an extraordinary capacity for bureaucracy and organization. Under his direction, the SS transformed radically. Himmler wanted to create not simply a police force or a security guard, but something more ambitious and more sinister. A racial elite, a modern order of chivalry based not on medieval blood nobility, but on what he called Germanic racial purity. To enter the SS, candidates had to prove that their ancestors had no Jewish blood or racial impurity, dating back to 1600, a requirement that over time became even stricter. They had to meet precise physical requirements, minimum height, health status, bodily proportions that coincided with the ideals of Nazi racial anthropology, and they had to be young. The organization sought to mold minds that were still malleable. This selection process was not arbitrary, it was intentional. Himmler understood something fundamental about human psychology. If you convince someone that they belong to an elite, that they have been chosen because they are superior, that person will internalize that belief in a way that will make them capable of things they would otherwise never do. Belonging to an elite creates a powerful identity, and that identity can be channeled. But the SS were not going to remain just a political organization. They were going to need an armed branch. And that armed branch would, over time, become what was known as the Waffen-SS, the Armed SS. And within the Waffen-SS, one of the first units to be formed, one of those that would most directly bear the stamp of Himmler's obsessions, was the one that would eventually become Das Reich. But that is getting too far ahead, because before Das Reich existed, before the Waffen-SS as such existed, there was a crucial stage that defined the character of that entire military machinery and its ways of operating. In the early years of the Nazi regime, Himmler established the SS Wehrführungstruppe, which could be translated as SSS dispositional troops. These were military units within the SS that were not destined for police functions, but for actual combat. Himmler's idea was to create forces that answered directly to Hitler and the SS, separate from the regular German army, the Wehrmacht. This was a source of constant tension with the army generals, who viewed with suspicion and sometimes contempt these new troops that threatened their monopoly on military power. The S-Wehrführungstruppe began to organize seriously in the 1930s. Regiments were created with names that had profound symbolic meaning for Nazi ideology. One of them bore the name Deutschland, Germany, another, Germania, and a third, Der Führer. This last one, the Der Führer Regiment, had a special characteristic. It was made up mainly of Austrian and Southeastern European German-speaking volunteers, the so-called Volksdeutsche, or ethnic Germans. This composition would have important consequences later on. The training of these troops was extraordinarily rigorous. It did not resemble the basic training of the regular army. It was physically brutal, designed to push recruits to the limit of their physical capabilities and beyond. But even more important was the ideological component. The soldiers of the SS Wehrführungstruppe received intensive political indoctrination. They were taught the Nazi worldview, the superiority of the Aryan race, the threat of international Judaism, the need for living space for the German people, the historical mission of the Third Reich. They were not simply soldiers. They were told they were warriors of a sacred cause, the custodians of the future of the Germanic race. This indoctrination was not superficial. It was systematic, constant, and designed to replace the individual's previous value system with a completely new one. The young recruits, many of them teenagers who had grown up in Nazi Germany, or who came from sympathizing families, arrived at the SS Wehrführungstruppe with minds already molded by years of regime propaganda. The Hitler Youth had done much of the preparatory work. What they found in the SS military units was an intensification of what they already knew, taken to its most extreme expression. And what happened to those who questioned? To those who felt doubts, discomfort, moral resistance? The organization's answer was clear. Peer pressure was overwhelming. The culture of the SS was deeply collectivist in the worst sense. There was no room for individual dissent. Loyalty to the group, to the Führer, to the mission was absolute. Any sign of weakness, of doubt, of misplaced compassion was seen as treason. And in an organization that valued toughness above all else, being perceived as weak was the worst possible social condemnation. It is important to pause here for a moment, because this dynamic is fundamental to understanding everything that followed. What Himmler and his lieutenants were creating was not simply another army. They were creating a specific institutional culture with its own values, its own rituals, its own mechanisms of reward and punishment. And that culture was, at its core, profoundly dehumanizing, both toward declared enemies and more subtly, toward the very members of the organization, who were treated as instruments serving an abstract cause, rather than as individuals with inherent value. The SS Wehrführungstruppe had their baptism of fire in September 1939. With the invasion of Poland, the German Lightning War, the Blitzkrieg, crushed the Polish forces in less than 5 weeks. For the SS Wehrführungstruppe, it was a first experience of real combat. They operated in several sectors of the Polish front, sometimes with notable effectiveness, and sometimes with coordination problems that revealed their relative inexperience in large-scale combat. But more significant than their tactical performance was something that occurred in Poland and established a pattern that would repeat over and over again. Atrocities began almost from the very first day of the invasion, and they were not committed solely by the SS. Wehrmacht units also participated in massacres and executions of Polish civilians and prisoners of war. But the SS, including the paramilitary units accompanying the army, were particularly active in these actions. In Poland, the Nazis put into practice a deliberate policy of decapitation of the Polish intellectual and political elite, teachers, priests, doctors, politicians, community leaders. The idea was to destroy Poland's ability to organize as a nation. The massacres of Bydgoszcz, where thousands of Polish civilians were murdered in the first days of the occupation, are just one of the many examples of what occurred in that first laboratory of Nazi brutality. For the SS Wehrführungstruppe that participated in the Polish campaign, this exposure to violence against civilians had an important cumulative effect. Not everyone participated directly in the massacres, but the fact that they occurred, that they were known within the ranks, that there were no consequences for those who committed them, but rather rewards and recognition, established a norm. It established that killing civilians was acceptable, that conventional rules of war did not apply when it came to subhumans, as Nazi propaganda classified Slavs, Jews, everyone who did not belong to the Aryan category. After the Polish campaign, the SS Wehrführungstruppe were reorganized and strengthened. New units were added, equipment was improved, training was intensified, and the great stage for the next phase arrived, the war in the West. In May 1940, Germany launched its offensive against France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The campaign was an unprecedented strategic triumph. In less than 6 weeks, France, which was considered the strongest military power in Western Europe, surrendered. The British army was expelled from the continent in the desperate evacuation of Dunkirk. The Netherlands and Belgium fell in days. It was the greatest military shock of the 20th century up to that point. The SS Wehrführungstruppe actively participated in this campaign, and it was during the French campaign of 1940 that an incident occurred that would foreshadow with disturbing precision what would happen 4 years later. On the 2nd of June 1940, in the town of Wormhout in northern France, soldiers from the Der Führer regiment of the SS committed a massacre against British and French prisoners of war. The prisoners were herded into a barn and murdered. Some were shot directly. Others died when they were forced to throw themselves on grenades to protect their captors. approximately 80 prisoners of war died. This massacre, known as the Wormhout Massacre, was committed by soldiers under the command of Standartenführer Wilhelm Dietrich. And at that moment, just as in many other similar moments that would occur in the following years, there were no consequences for those responsible. There was no serious investigation. There was no trial. There was no sanction. The culture of impunity that had been established from the beginning continued to function as a lubricant that made each new atrocity possible. After the fall of France in June 1940, the SS-Verfügungstruppe were formally converted into a division, the SS Division Das Reich. The name Das Reich, which means the Empire or the Reich, was deliberately chosen to underscore the grandiose mission attributed to this unit. It was not simply a regiment or a brigade. It was, according to Nazi rhetoric, the very incarnation of the imperial enterprise of the Third Reich. The division received additional equipment, new artillery units, engineers, signals. It became a more complex and powerful fighting force, and its next great campaign arrived very soon, although in a direction that no one would have easily predicted. In the spring of 1941, while Hitler was preparing what would be his greatest geopolitical gamble, the invasion of the Soviet Union, an unexpected problem arose in the Balkans. Germany's ally, the Yugoslav regime of Prince Regent Paul, had signed the tripartite pact with Germany, Italy, and Japan. But on the 6th of March 1941, a coup d'etat led by Yugoslav army officers overthrew the pro-Nazi government and proclaimed the young King Peter II as effective monarch. The new government repudiated the pact with Germany. Hitler reacted with fury. He ordered the immediate attack on Yugoslavia. On the 6th of April 1941, the Luftwaffe brutally bombed Belgrade, killing more than 17,000 civilians in what was one of the most devastating bombings of the war. At the same time, German, Italian, Hungarian, and Bulgarian troops invaded Yugoslavia from multiple directions. Das Reich was one of the divisions that participated in this campaign. The Yugoslav campaign lasted barely 12 days. The Yugoslav army, poorly equipped and poorly coordinated, was crushed. Organised resistance collapsed almost immediately. But even in that brief campaign, Das Reich left a mark. In the capture of the city of Belgrade, Das Reich soldiers staged a dramatic entry into the city, planting Nazi flags on key buildings. It was one of those moments of military theatre that Nazi propaganda loved to photograph and film for domestic consumption. But Yugoslavia was also the stage for something more significant in the long term, the beginning of a brutal war of occupation that would stretch on for years. The Yugoslav resistance, divided between Draza Mihailovic's Chetniks and Josip Broz Tito's communist partisans, would very soon begin a guerrilla war that would provoke brutal reprisals from the German occupiers. Although Das Reich did not directly participate in anti-partisan operations in Yugoslavia at this stage, the experience of the Balkan campaign reinforced the mentality that civilians in occupied territories were potential threats, that resistance was an excuse for collective reprisal, and that the conventional rules of war did not apply in the inferior spaces of Eastern and Southeastern Europe. And then came the operation that changed everything. The operation that would define the character of Das Reich, that would reveal just how far that unit was willing to go, and that would create the ideological and psychological context from which the catastrophe of 1944 in France would emerge. On the 22nd of June 1941, more than 3 million German soldiers crossed the Soviet border in what was the largest invasion in military history. Germany and its allies attacked the Soviet Union along a front of approximately 3,000 kilometers. Operation Barbarossa, as it was called, began with a series of German victories so spectacular that they seemed to confirm the worst predictions of the Soviet pessimists and the most optimistic fantasies of the Nazi strategists. Das Reich was assigned to Army Group Center, the most powerful formation of the three into which the Eastern Front was divided. Army Group Center advanced towards Moscow, the heart of Soviet power. In the first weeks, the advances were astonishing. The Soviet army, disorganized by Stalin's purges in previous years and taken by surprise, despite multiple intelligence warnings, collapsed across large sectors of the front. Giant encirclement pockets, like those at Minsk and Smolensk, trapped hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers, who were then taken prisoner or died fighting. For Das Reich, the war in the East was a radically different experience from anything before. France had been relatively quick and relatively clean in terms of conventional combat. Yugoslavia had been extremely brief, but the Soviet Union was a different world. The space was incomprehensibly vast. The distances were exhausting. Roads were frequently non-existent or impassable, especially when the autumn rains arrived, and the dirt roads turned into seas of mud that trapped vehicles. And the enemy, unlike what Nazi propaganda had promised, was tough, resilient, and capable of surprising. But the most disturbing aspect of the war in the East was not the resistance of the Red Army. It was what happened behind the lines. Operation Barbarossa was not simply a military campaign. It was, from the beginning, and deliberately so, a war of annihilation. Hitler and the Nazi leaders had made it clear before the invasion that the war in the East would be different from any previous war. International law would not apply. Soviet political commissars, who were the Communist Party representatives in military units, were to be summarily executed upon capture, without trial. Soviet prisoners of war would not be treated according to the Geneva Conventions, and civilian populations in occupied areas, especially Jewish ones, were destined for a fate that would become increasingly clear in the weeks and months to follow. The mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen followed the German army through Soviet territory, massacring Jews, communists, and other enemies en masse. At Babi Yar, near Kiev, between the 29th and 30th of September 1941, 33,771 Jews were shot in 2 days. It was one of the largest single-event massacres in the entire history of the Holocaust. And Das Reich. What was the relationship of this division to those massacres? It is a question that historians have examined for decades. The answer is not simple. The Waffen-SS and the Security SS were related, but distinct bodies, although both ultimately answered to Himmler. The Einsatzgruppen were units of the Security SS, not the Waffen-SS. But the separation between the two spheres was not hermetic. There was cooperation, there was exchange of information. There were occasions when Waffen-SS units participated in or facilitated security operations against civilians. And above all, they shared the same institutional culture, the same ideology, the same moral frame of reference that made all of that possible. Das Reich advanced westward, then southward, and finally northward in the early months of the Soviet campaign, following the movements of Army Group Center. It participated in some of the hardest battles of that period, the Battle of Smolensk in July and August 1941, where German forces managed to encircle and destroy multiple Soviet armies, but at the cost of considerable losses of their own. The division fought with notable effectiveness in conventional combat, establishing a reputation as one of the best combat units in the German army, not just the Waffen-SS. But the autumn of 1941 brought with it something that German planners had not adequately anticipated: the mud. The Germans called this Rasputitsa, the mud season. The October rains turned Soviet roads into impossible traps. Vehicles sank, horses died of exhaustion, supplies did not arrive, and while the advance slowed down, the Red Army used that time to reorganize, receive reinforcements, and prepare the defense of Moscow. The Battle of Moscow was the turning point of the war. Das Reich was one of the divisions that participated in the final great push toward the Soviet capital in the autumn of 1941, in the so-called Operation Typhoon. German troops came close enough to see the towers of the Kremlin through their binoculars. It seemed the fall of Moscow was a matter of days, and then everything stopped. On the 5th of December 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counter-offensive, with temperatures dropping to -40 degrees Celsius. With Soviet soldiers equipped for winter and German soldiers, still in summer uniforms because Hitler had assured them the war would be over before winter. The German lines bent and in some places broke. Das Reich, like many other German divisions, had to retreat fighting under terrible conditions. The losses were enormous. The German divisions that had reached the outskirts of Moscow with their forces depleted, but intact in structure, returned from the Soviet winter as shadows of themselves. Das Reich lost thousands of soldiers in combat, from wounds, from frostbite. Their vehicles broke down in the cold. Their weapons froze. Their supply lines were inadequate. And it was in this context of extreme brutality, of desperate struggle for survival, of ideological conviction that they were fighting against an enemy who deserved no mercy, where the methods of Das Reich began to harden in ways that would have direct consequences on the civilian populations of the territories they passed through. In the anti-partisan war, developing simultaneously in the occupied areas behind the front, Das Reich and other Waffen-SS units participated in operations that went far beyond what could be considered legitimate combat. Collective reprisals against villages suspected of supporting partisans became an established practice. If a German soldier was killed or wounded in an ambush near a village, the village paid the price. Houses were burned. Men were executed in proportions that could be 50, 100, 200 civilians for every dead German soldier. This arithmetic of crime, as some historians have called it, was not something soldiers invented on the fly. It was codified in official orders coming from above, from high command, from the SS, ultimately from Hitler himself. The guidelines for the conduct of the troops in Russia and the Commissar Order established the legal framework, if it can be called that, within which these atrocities operated. Soldiers committing these actions could tell themselves they were simply following orders, acting within a framework established by their superiors, that what they were doing was necessary and justified. What do you think of the content? Do you like this type of video? Then comment the phrase, "I want more stories." This will encourage us to bring more historical topics and will also help with the video's engagement. Alright? Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like so YouTube continues recommending our videos to you. This is one of the darkest and most important aspects of the Das Reich phenomenon and of the Waffen-SS in general, the role of institutional obedience in the commission of atrocities. The philosopher Hannah Arendt coined the phrase "the banality of evil" to describe Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat who coordinated the logistics of the Holocaust. But the idea applies more broadly. Evil does not always require extraordinary monsters. Sometimes it only requires ordinary people placed in a system that normalizes crime, that sanctions atrocity, that punishes dissent and rewards obedience, even when what is being obeyed is an order to kill innocents. On the Eastern Front, that system functioned with terrifying efficiency. And the soldiers of Das Reich, like those of many other units, were shaped by that system in ways that would make them capable of things that would have seemed impossible before the war. After the Soviet winter, Das Reich was pulled from the front to be reconstituted. The losses had been so severe that the division needed rest, reinforcements, and reorganization. For much of 1942, Das Reich was in France, in the German occupation zone, where it was rebuilt and trained once again. And that is when something important happened in its internal composition. The reinforcements that arrived at Das Reich in 1942 included a growing number of foreign volunteers, especially from Germanic or German-speaking countries, Flemish Belgians, Dutch, Danes, Norwegians, and above all, the already mentioned Volksdeutsche from southeastern Europe, ethnic Germans from Romania, Yugoslavia, Hungary. Recruits from Alsace and Lorraine also arrived, the border regions between France and Germany that Germany had incorporated into the Reich after the defeat of France in 1940. Many of these Alsatians were not volunteers in any real sense of the word. They had been forcibly conscripted under a policy the Nazis called "la malgré nous," the despite ourselves, meaning those incorporated into the German army against their will. This detail about the Alsatians is crucial and will become important later when we reach the legal aftermath of Das Reich's crimes. But for now, let's continue with the story. In January 1943, Das Reich returned to the Eastern Front, and it was upon that return that it starred in one of the most dramatic and most cited episodes of its entire history as a unit, the Third Battle of Kharkov. Kharkov was the fourth largest city in the Soviet Union, an important industrial centre in the region of Ukraine. In the context of the massive German defeat at Stalingrad, where in early February 1943 the German Sixth Army was annihilated and over 300,000 soldiers were killed or captured, the German front in southern Russia was in a critical situation. The Soviet army had launched a massive counter-offensive and taken Kharkov on the 16th of February 1943. The Germans had been expelled from the city, but at that critical moment, one of the most talented and most ruthless commanders of the Waffen-SS entered the scene. Oberstgruppenführer Paul Hauser, known as Papa Hauser, who commanded the SS Panzer Corps, of which Das Reich was a part alongside the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler and Totenkopf divisions. Hauser was a veteran of the First World War, an ex-officer of the regular German army who had joined the SS in the 1930s. He was a first-class military commander with an instinctive sense for combined arms combat, and in the weeks following the fall of Kharkov, Hauser convinced his superiors that it was possible not only to halt the Soviet advance, but to retake the city. The maneuver that followed was a classic example of deliberate fallback operations followed by a counterattack. The SS Panzer Corps allowed the Soviet advance to overextend itself, creating vulnerable flanks, and then launched a devastating counterattack. Das Reich played a central role in this operation, fighting with a brutal effectiveness that inflicted enormous losses on the Soviet units. On the 14th of March 1943, the troops of the SS Panzer Corps, with Das Reich in the vanguard, retook Kharkov. It was the only major Soviet city that was recaptured by the Germans after having lost it. For Nazi propaganda, it was a massive victory, a symbol that Germany could still win the war despite Stalingrad. For the German army, it was a brilliant example of operational skill, and for Das Reich, it was the peak of its reputation as an elite combat unit. But what happened in Kharkov during and after the battle? That is the question that Das Reich apologists prefer not to answer. The city was subjected to brutal reprisals during the German reconquest. Communist Party members, wounded Soviet soldiers who could not evacuate, Jewish citizens who had survived in hiding, all became targets of the uncontrolled violence of the soldiers. Mass executions, deliberate burning of buildings, and acts of brutality that went far beyond military necessity were documented. But Kharkov passed, and Das Reich kept moving. The next great battle was Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, where Germany attempted one last great offensive strike on the Eastern Front and failed. Das Reich participated in the offensive toward the north of the Kursk salient, with its battalions of Panzer IV tanks and its 1st Panzer VI Tigers and Panzer V Panthers fighting in the centre of the bloodiest battle of the war. After Kursk, the strategic initiative passed definitively to the Red Army. The Germans entered a retreat that would not end until their final defeat. Das Reich fought in countless rearguard battles in Ukraine throughout the rest of 1943 and early 1944. Belgorod, Poltava, Kremenchug, the Dnieper. In every engagement, the division displayed the same mixture of tactical skill and boundless brutality that had characterized its actions since Poland. In the summer of 1943, Das Reich was upgraded to a Panzer division, incorporating more tanks and armoured vehicles into its organisation. It became the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. This change reflected the evolution of the war. It was no longer enough to have fast motorised infantry. Heavy armour was needed for the containment battles on the Eastern Front. And then came a moment that would change the destiny of Das Reich in a way its members could not anticipate. In late 1943 and early 1944, while the Eastern Front continued to drain German forces, Reich strategists began to worry about another front, the West. It was obvious to anyone who could look at a map that the Western Allies, Great Britain and the United States, were amassing forces in the United Kingdom for a massive invasion of the European continent. The question was not if it would happen, but when and where. In that context, Hitler and the German High Command made the decision to transfer Das Reich from the Eastern Front to France. The division needed to be rebuilt after enormous losses in the East, and France seemed the right place to do that rebuilding. Southern France, far from the front, was a relatively quiet area where the division could receive new recruits, new equipment, and rest from years of continuous combat. But relatively quiet was not the same as peaceful, because in southern France, the French resistance, the Maquis, had grown enormously in previous years. The term Maquis came from the French word referring to the dense, low vegetation of the Mediterranean, the terrain where the guerrillas hid. The Maquisards were resistance fighters operating in the mountains, forests, and valleys of rural France, sabotaging German infrastructure, attacking patrols, gathering and transmitting intelligence to the Allies. And in early June 1944, Das Reich was garrisoned in the area of Montauban, a city north of Toulouse in the Tarn-et-Garonne department in southern France. It was a division that had spent 4 years in brutal war in the East. Its soldiers were moulded by that brutal training and that experience. Its officers had learned to respond to resistance with collective reprisal, and its new recruits, many of them very young, had been indoctrinated into the ideology that made that response not only acceptable but mandatory. What could go wrong? The answer came on the 6th of June 1944. That day, the Allies landed in Normandy. D-Day, the largest amphibious landing operation in history, changed the war in an instant. 156,000 Allied soldiers crossed the English Channel and established a beachhead on the coast of Normandy. It was the beginning of the end for the Third Reich, although that would not be immediately evident. For Das Reich, the news of the landing changed everything. The division received orders to march north, towards Normandy, to help contain the Allied beachhead. It was a distance of approximately 700 kilometres. For a well-equipped armoured division in peacetime, it could be covered in days. But they were in France in 1944, where the resistance was active and where Allied aviation dominated the daytime sky, which meant that any column of vehicles moving by day was vulnerable to devastating aerial attacks. And as Das Reich began its march northward, 2 events occurred in rapid succession that would trigger a cascade of violence against French civilians that the world would never forget. The first occurred on the 9th of June 1944 in the city of Toul. Toul was the capital of the Corrèze department in the Limousin region in central France. It was a medium-sized city known for its lace industry and its weapons factories. The latter operated under German occupation. On the 8th of June 1944, Maquisards from the Front Terrorize et Partisans, the communist partisans, took the city in a bold uprising. For 24 hours they controlled Toul, and during that time acts of violence occurred on both sides. 40 German soldiers from the Toul garrison died in the fighting. Some of them were killed after surrendering, which constituted a violation of the laws of war. The bodies of some German soldiers appeared mutilated, although the true extent of this was probably exaggerated by subsequent German propaganda. At the same time, the Maquisards freed prisoners from the local jail, executed collaborators, and organised a provisional administration for the city. On the 9th of June, the vanguard of Das Reich, the Der Führer Regiment, under the command of Sturmbannführer Heinrich Wolf, arrived in Toul and retook the city without much difficulty. The Maquisards had retreated. The city returned to German control. And then the reprisal began. The zone commander, SS Sturmbannführer, Heinrich Kiefner, received orders and made decisions that would define what would happen that day in Toul. Following the established policy of collective reprisals, the Germans decided there would be hangings in response to the deaths of their soldiers. The soldiers of Das Reich swept the city, gathering all the men in the central square. Men were selected from those gathered, often arbitrarily. Some were accused of being partisans. Others were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was no judicial process, no determination of individual guilt, no tribunal. The selection was quick, almost random, guided by denunciations from collaborators, by unfounded suspicions, by the simple bad luck of being present. 99 men were hanged. 99. Their bodies were hung from balconies, from lampposts, from tree branches along the main streets of Toul. Tags reading Maquis were hung around their necks. Their families were forced to witness the hangings or to live with the sight of their fathers, husbands, sons, and brothers' bodies hanging in the streets of their city. Furthermore, some 420 more men were deported to concentration camps in Germany, mainly to Dachau. Many of them never returned. What happened in Toul on the 9th of June 1944 was not an act of spontaneous outburst of violence. It was a calculated reprisal, executed following an established doctrine by soldiers of a specific unit who knew exactly what they were doing. The inhabitants of Toul had not attacked the German soldiers. Most of the hanged men were not Maquisards. They were civilians, workers, fathers, who simply lived in a city that had the misfortune of being the theatre of an uprising that had already ended when the executioners arrived. But Toul was only the prelude, because the next day, the 10th of June 1944, something occurred that has no parallel in the history of the occupation of Western Europe. The village of Oradour-sur-Glane was about 140 kilometres north of Toul in the Haute-Vienne department. It was a small country town, the kind that dot the French landscape with their stone houses, their centuries-old churches, their main square, and their cafes. It had approximately 1,200 inhabitants in normal times, although on that particular day, the population was somewhat swollen by the presence of displaced persons from other parts of France who had sought refuge there. Why Oradour-sur-Glane? This question has been debated for decades, and the complete answer will probably never be known for certain. What is known is what happened that day, documented with almost unbearable meticulousness, by the testimonies of the few survivors and by subsequent investigations. That same day, the 9th of June, a prominent Das Reich commander named Helmut Kampfer had been captured by Maquis partisans somewhere in the region. Kampfer was a Sturmbannführer, a commander of the 3rd Battalion of the Der Führer Regiment of Das Reich. He was respected and loved among his comrades, including Sturmbannführer Adolf Diekmann, commander of the 1st Battalion of the same regiment. The capture of Kampfer was a blow, and according to some versions of events, Diekmann received information, possibly from an informer or a confused interpretation of intelligence, that Kampfer or some German officer was being held in Oradour-sur-Glane, or in some village with a similar name. There are several villages with similar names in the region. Oradour-sur-Glane was a quiet village, with no significant history of resistance activity, but its name sounded similar to other places that were associated with the Maquis. But even if this initial confusion existed, it does not completely explain what happened, because what followed was not a search and rescue operation, it was a systematic massacre. On the 10th of June 1944, mid-morning, a column from the 1st Battalion of the Der Führer Regiment under the command of Diekmann arrived in Oradour-sur-Glane. The soldiers surrounded the village immediately, establishing a perimeter that prevented anyone from entering or leaving. An officer announced to the inhabitants that there would be an identity document check. Everyone had to report to the central square. The inhabitants obeyed. They had no reason to suspect it was anything other than a routine inspection. Annoying, but not dangerous. The children were taken out of school by their teachers and brought to the square along with their parents. The elderly, the young, pregnant women, the sick, everyone was taken to the square. Then the German soldiers divided the crowd. The women and children were taken to the village church. The men were divided into 6 groups and taken to different buildings, barns, garages, sheds. In those buildings, without warning, without any declaration, without being allowed to speak, defend themselves, or understand what was happening, the soldiers opened fire with machine guns. The men fell. Some died immediately. Others, wounded, lay among the corpses, and then the soldiers set fire to the buildings, with the dead and the dying inside. A small number of men managed to escape, 5 or 6, climbing out of windows or moving among the corpses with such speed that the soldiers did not see them. They were the only male survivors of the village that day. And in the church, where the women and children were confined. In the church of Oradour-sur-Glane, 452 people were locked up. The soldiers placed an incendiary device in the centre of the church and ignited it. The device produced a thick smoke that began to asphyxiate those inside. When those confined there tried to escape, crashing against the doors that had been secured from the outside, the soldiers fired from the windows and doors into the interior. The women and children who did not die from the gunfire burned to death when the soldiers set the church on fire. The heat was so intense that the church organ melted. The tower bells fell onto the charred corpses. Only one woman survived of those locked in the church. Her name was Marguerite Roufonche. With superhuman courage, she managed to crawl to a small window behind the altar, broke the glass, fell outside, and crawled to the nearby bushes while the soldiers fired behind her. Another woman who tried to follow her through that same window was hit by the bullets and died. Marguerite Roufonche was found the next day, hiding among the plants. She was the only survivor of those locked in the church, and her testimony, which she would give to the French authorities in the weeks and months to follow, was one of the pillars of the subsequent knowledge of what had happened that day in Oradour-sur-Glane. The massacre of Oradour-sur-Glane cost the lives of 642 people. 225 of them were women, 247 were children. The village was looted and then completely destroyed. Every house, every building was set on fire. The soldiers took the livestock, the wine, the money, and the valuables they found. They left behind smoking ruins and 642 dead. Among the dead were people of different backgrounds. There were refugees from other departments who had sought peace in that quiet corner of France. There was a group of children from a school in Lorient who were visiting the village. There were babies. There were elderly people who could not walk without help. Dijkman's reaction to what his troops did that day deserves careful analysis. According to subsequent testimonies from other Das Reich officers, including the division commander himself, Brigadeführer Heinz Lammerding, Dijkman was reprimanded for exceeding his instructions. Lammerding supposedly said the massacre had gone too far. There was even a hint that Dijkman might face an SS court-martial for his actions. This narrative, that of the massacre as an excess committed by an officer who strayed from his orders, was convenient for many after the war. It allowed for a distinction between the good Das Reich soldiers, who were simply obeying legitimate orders, and the bad Dijkman, who had gone out of control. The problem with this narrative is that it is simply not sustainable in light of the facts and the broader context. First, Dijkman was never tried. He died in combat in Normandy a few weeks after the massacre, on the 29th of June 1944. His death eliminated the most immediate and convenient culprit. Second, the massacre of Oradour-sur-Glane did not happen in a vacuum. It happened the day after the Toul hangings, which were carried out following formal orders from the Das Reich chain of command. The culture of collective reprisal against civilians was not the product of the twisted mind of an individual. It was the policy of the unit, endorsed by its commanders, consistent with the doctrine the Waffen-SS had practiced in the East for years. Third, Lamadin, the division commander, not only did not stop the reprisal, but he issued an order on the very same 9th of June, the day of the Toul hangings, demanding that those responsible for any attack against German soldiers be hanged, and that the villages where those responsible came from be burned. This order, which was distributed in the region, and which some argue may have come to Diekmann's knowledge before the massacre, establishes the line of responsibility in a very clear way. The truth about Oradour-sur-Glane is that it was not the act of a loose madman. It was the product of a unit with a specific culture, a specific doctrine, and a chain of command that enabled that culture and that doctrine. It was, in the most precise sense of the word, an organisational crime. But why France? Why on French soil, in Christian Western Europe, did Das Reich soldiers behave in a way that even other Germans considered excessive? This is the most disturbing question in the whole story, and the answer has several layers worth exploring in detail. The first layer is ideological. For Das Reich soldiers, especially for the Eastern Front veterans, the distinction between the East and the West was important, but not as important as the distinction between us and them. Nazi ideology established racial hierarchies. Germanic and Scandinavian peoples were at the top. The French were on a lower rung, but were considered racially relatable, and Slavs and Jews were at the bottom. In theory, France should have been treated with more consideration than the Soviet Union. But the ideology also established that armed resistance was intolerable, that any aid to the enemies of the Reich was treason, and that collective reprisals were not only acceptable, but necessary to maintain order. And when Das Reich soldiers arrived in southern France, after years in the East, they brought with them the methods learned in that theatre of war. The Maquis was viewed through the same prism as the Soviet partisans, enemies without a uniform, outside the law, against whom everything was permitted. The second layer is psychological. The soldiers who committed the massacre of Oradour-sur-Glane were not monsters in the popular sense of the word. They were human beings who had been moulded for years by a system that had taught them to dehumanize their victims, that had given them impunity for violence, that had rewarded them for toughness and punished them for weakness or compassion. The process of desensitization that began in the barracks and accelerated on the Eastern Front had produced individuals capable of committing acts that, outside of that context, would have been unthinkable. But this does not absolve them. Psychological and philosophical research into the commission of group atrocities has repeatedly shown that perpetrators almost always have choices, even if those choices have costs. Studies of massacre perpetrators, including Christopher Browning's pioneering work on Reserve Police Battalion 101, have shown that in many cases the men who participated in mass executions had the ability to refuse or to step back, and that those who did so generally did not suffer severe consequences. Most did not because they were unable, but because the group context, peer pressure, the fear of being perceived as weak, and ideological indoctrination made refusal seem unthinkable. The third layer is strategic. Das Reich received the order to march to Normandy as quickly as possible. Every day of delay was another day for the Allies to consolidate their beachhead. The resistance of the Maquis, which sabotaged bridges, cut telephone lines, attacked convoys, and caused delays, was seen by Das Reich commanders not only as an inconvenience but as a strategic threat. Reprisals against the civilian population had, from the perspective of those commanders, a strategic justification to terrorize the population so they would stop supporting the resistance. But this justification had the opposite effect. The massacres of Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane did not weaken the French resistance, they strengthened it. The news of what had happened spread throughout France in days, despite German efforts to control the information. Frenchmen who had hesitated about joining the resistance hesitated no more. The Maquis grew, sabotages multiplied, and the German army throughout France paid the price for the indignation of a population that had seen what the occupiers were capable of. The march of Das Reich toward Normandy was an ordeal. Allied aviation attacked their columns repeatedly during the day, forcing the division to move mainly at night. The roads were slow. Bridges had been destroyed by the resistance or by bombings. What should have taken 3 days took more than 2 weeks. Das Reich did not reach the Normandy front in full combat conditions until late June, when the Allied beachhead was already firmly established. Did the Maquis contribute to that delay? Undoubtedly. Was that delay decisive? That is more debatable. Some historians argue that Das Reich, had it reached Normandy in the first days after D-Day, might have tipped the balance in favour of Germany in the most critical period of the landing. Others maintain that Allied air superiority and the sheer scale of the landing made the consolidation of the beachhead inevitable, regardless of when Das Reich arrived. What is certain is that Das Reich's march across France was a trail of violence that left a permanent scar on the collective memory of many French communities. Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane are the best-known cases, but they were not the only incidents. There were executions in other towns, civilians killed in minor incidents, properties destroyed, people arrested and deported all along the division's march route. To understand the full dimension of what Das Reich did in France, it is necessary to re-examine the context of who the men committing these actions were. Because the composition of Das Reich in 1944 was very different from that of previous years. The surviving veterans of the Eastern Front were the ideological and tactical backbone of the division. They were men hardened by years of brutal combat, accustomed to violence in all its forms, with a sense of identity deeply tied to the unit and the cause it represented. For many of them, the war had destroyed whatever moral barrier might have existed before. What they had seen, what they had done, what they had suffered, had transformed them into different people from who they had been at the start of the war. But alongside those veterans were many new recruits, much younger, teenagers who were barely 16 or 17 years old in some cases, volunteers from German-speaking countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and the Alsatians, whom we already mentioned, young men who had been forcibly incorporated into the German army, who did not want to be there, but who were there nonetheless, in a uniform they had not chosen and under orders they could not refuse without severe consequences. This detail about the Alsatians would become enormously relevant in the post-war years, when the time came to seek justice. The Das Reich division reached the Normandy front in late June 1944 and was immediately thrown into the most intense combat of its entire history. The battles around Saint-Lô, Caen, the Norman Bocage, were of almost unimaginable brutality. The Bocage terrain, with its high hedgerows compartmentalising the landscape into small fields, was a nightmare for armour and favourable for defenders. The Allies, despite their superiority in men, equipment and air support, advanced slowly, paying an enormous price in casualties. Das Reich fought with the desperation of someone who knows they are fighting an unstoppable tide. Its tank battalions, including the formidable Tiger I and the newer Tiger II, inflicted tremendous casualties among Allied armour. But their own losses were also devastating. Allied aviation was omnipresent during the day. Allied artillery was crushing, and behind the front, the Maquis continued to operate. During this period, Das Reich participated in one of the most famous engagements of the Norman front, the battle for the village of Villers-Bocage, where the commander of Tiger 205 of the 101st Heavy Panzer Battalion, Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, engaged the British 7th Armoured Brigade on the 13th of June 1944. In a bold and extraordinarily skillful attack, Wittmann's Tiger destroyed over 20 Allied vehicles in minutes, causing chaos in the British ranks and temporarily halting their advance. It was one of the most dramatic episodes of the Normandy campaign. But Das Reich was not alone in Normandy. The Allied army, with its incomparably superior resources, was tightening the noose. Operation Cobra, launched on the 25th of July 1944 by General George Patton's US Third Army, finally broke the German lines and unleashed an encircling manoeuvre around the German Army Group B, the so-called Falaise Pocket, trapped tens of thousands of German soldiers between its walls, including many from Das Reich. The Battle of the Falaise Pocket in August 1944 was for many German units a catastrophe of the same magnitude as Stalingrad. The Allies closed the bag from the north and south. The Luftwaffe could not protect the ground troops. The roads were filled with corpses, destroyed vehicles, dead horses, soldiers trying to escape on foot. It was one of the most horrific moments of the entire war. Das Reich managed to escape the Falaise Pocket, but at an enormous price. The division that had arrived in Normandy with thousands of men and hundreds of armoured vehicles emerged from the pocket with a fraction of its resources. Its tanks were few, its trucks scarce, its soldiers exhausted and decimated, but it continued to be recognised as a unit, which in itself was an achievement given the circumstances. After Falaise, Das Reich participated in the general German retreat across France. The Allies advanced with surprising speed, aided by the effervescence of the liberation and the collapse of the German front in the west. Paris was liberated on the 25th of August 1944. The Allied armies crossed the Seine, and the remnants of Das Reich retreated toward Germany, fighting in a series of rearguard actions in Belgium and the Netherlands. In September 1944, Das Reich crossed the German border for the first time since being sent east in 1941. The division was withdrawn for reconstruction for the fourth or fifth time in the war. It was a shadow of itself in material terms, but its myth and its denomination survived intact in the Reich's archives and in the minds of those who had known it. The reconstruction of Das Reich was surprisingly fast, given the catastrophic state of German resources at that time. The Reich was being attacked on all flanks. Allied aerial bombings were destroying cities and factories. Oil refineries were in ruins. Fuel production was critical. Conscription drew increasingly on very young and very old men who in normal times would never have been mobilized. But the bureaucratic machinery of the Third Reich kept functioning, reorganizing, reallocating, sending reinforcements, and Das Reich was reconstituted once again, this time to participate in Hitler's last great offensive gamble in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, the Ardennes Offensive. In December 1944, Hitler launched a massive offensive in the Belgian Ardennes, the mountainous and wooded region where Germany had broken through in the French campaign of 1940. The idea was to cut Allied supply lines, reach the port of Antwerp, and divide the Allied armies, perhaps forcing a negotiated peace in the West that would allow him to concentrate all resources against the Soviets in the East. Das Reich participated in the Ardennes Offensive, although not in the central role played by the Leibstandarte Division. Das Reich units fought in several sectors of the battle, which lasted from the 16th of December 1944 until mid-January 1945. The German offensive made significant initial gains and created great alarm among the Allies, but was ultimately contained. The weather cleared and allowed Allied aviation to operate. American reinforcements arrived, and the German army, lacking fuel and adequate reserves, could not exploit its initial successes. The Ardennes Offensive was Germany's last significant offensive effort in the war. Afterward, the Wehrmacht could only retreat and fight defensive actions, while the Allies advanced from the west and the Soviets from the east, and Das Reich, reconstituted one more time, was sent back to the Eastern Front in the final months of the war. Das Reich's final battles took place in Hungary and Austria. The division fought in the battles around Lake Balaton in Hungary, participated in the defence of Vienna, and finally surrendered to American forces in Austria in May 1945. Many of its members preferred to surrender to the Americans rather than the Soviets, knowing what they could expect from the latter, given the war of annihilation they had waged in the East. On the 29th of April 1945, Das Reich accepted its final surrender. 4 days later, on the 8th of May, Germany formally capitulated. The war in Europe was over, and with it, the history of Das Reich as a military unit. But the legal and moral history of Das Reich was not over. it was just beginning. What happened to those responsible for the massacres of Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane? This part of the story is as complicated and as disturbing, in its own way, as the massacre itself. And it reveals something important about the difficulties of carrying out justice after crimes of this magnitude, especially when those crimes are the product of an organisation and not just individuals. First, the person most directly responsible for the massacre at Oradour-sur-Glane, Adolphe Diekmann, was dead. He died in Normandy on the 29th of June 1944, just 19 days after the massacre. He was never interrogated. He never faced any kind of process. He took to the grave his exact motivations and the precise degree to which he acted on orders or on his own initiative. The division commander, Heinz Lamadin, was sentenced to death in absentia by a French military tribunal in 1951 for his responsibility in the massacres. But Lamadin lived in West Germany, and the Federal Republic of Germany consistently refused to extradite him. He lived comfortably for the rest of his life as a construction entrepreneur in Düsseldorf, where he died in 1971 from an illness, without having spent a single day in prison for the crimes his troops committed under his command. This impunity of Lamadin is one of the most painful aspects of the post-war history of Das Reich. The Federal Republic of Germany, in its early decades, was notoriously reluctant to prosecute war criminals of the SS and the Wehrmacht. There was a mix of reasons for this: the need for the new Germany to integrate into NATO and the Western Bloc, which made it politically inconvenient to stir up the past too much; the presence in the judicial and political apparatus of the new Germany of many men who had served the Nazi regime in various capacities; and the simple complicity of a society that in many cases preferred to forget rather than confront. The most complicated situation arose with the Alsatians. Remember that many Das Reich soldiers in Oradour-sur-Glane were forcibly conscripted Alsatians, the so-called Malgreneurs. This circumstance divided post-war France in a way that took decades to resolve. On one hand, the families of the victims of Oradour-sur-Glane demanded justice, that those responsible be identified and condemned. On the other hand, the families of the Alsatians who had served in Das Reich, including those present in Oradour-sur-Glane, argued that their sons, husbands, and brothers had been victims themselves, victims of forced conscription, of circumstances, of the German state machinery that had turned them into instruments of a slaughter they would never have chosen to commit of their own free will. In 1953, the French government put a group of captured Das Reich members on trial in a process that took place in Bordeaux. The result was a legal and political scandal. 12 men were convicted, including some Alsatians. The convictions included death sentences for some, but the political pressure from Alsace, whose public opinion felt aggrieved by the prosecution of men who had been forcibly conscripted, was so intense that the French government passed a general amnesty a few weeks after the trial. All the condemned men were set free. This amnesty was received in Oradour-sur-Glane as a betrayal. The municipality of Oradour-sur-Glane symbolically broke its tie with the French nation for years. The wounds opened by that process took decades to heal, if they ever completely did. The village of Oradour-sur-Glane, by decision of General de Gaulle's French government, was not rebuilt. Its ruins were preserved exactly as they were left after the massacre. The roofless walls, the burned cars, the charred trams, the melted kitchen utensils, the shoes of the dead, everything was left there, frozen in the moment of the massacre, as a monument to the crime and a permanent accusation against the perpetrators. Beside it, a new Oradour-sur-Glane was built, where the current inhabitants live their lives, but the ruins of the old village are there, visited by hundreds of thousands of people every year, a reminder of what happened on the 10th of June 1944. But let's go back a moment, because there is something in this story that we have not sufficiently explored: the question of why Das Reich ended up being the unit it was. Why, out of all the divisions of the Waffen-SS and the Wehrmacht, does Das Reich bear that particular burden in historical memory? And the answer to that question takes us back to something we mentioned at the beginning, the process of creating an institutional culture. Das Reich was not always what it became. In the most literal sense, the unit began as an experiment. Is it possible to create an elite military force based on ideological criteria rather than conventional military ones? Himmler's bet was yes, that ideological purity and the conviction of historical mission could produce superior soldiers. And in purely military terms, that bet produced results. Das Reich was, by any objective measure of tactical and operational effectiveness, one of the best combat units in the German army. Its tankers, its infantrymen, its tactical commanders demonstrated remarkable combat skills time and time again. But the same culture that made them effective on the battlefield made them capable of the atrocities of Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane. The dehumanization of the enemy, the institutional impunity, the absolute loyalty to the group and the mission above any individual moral consideration. All these characteristics that were functional in conventional combat became monstrous when applied to defenseless civilians. And there is something else worth examining, the role of leadership. Heinz Lammerding was not an illuminated fanatic in the style of Heinrich Himmler. He was a competent and pragmatic officer, but he was also a man who had internalized the doctrine of the Waffen-SS to the point where ordering collective reprisals against civilians was, for him, a rational and appropriate response to partisan resistance. He didn't need to be an ideological fanatic to issue orders that would lead to the massacres of Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane. He merely needed to be a product of his system. This is perhaps the darkest lesson of the history of Das Reich, that the greatest atrocities in history are not always committed by out-of-control lunatics. They are frequently committed by well-structured organizations, whose members consider themselves rational, disciplined, and acting for the good of a greater cause. The danger lies not only in extreme individuals, it lies in the systems that make extremism possible. And what about the broader context? What does the history of Das Reich tell us about occupied France, about the resistance, about the relationship between occupiers and occupied? France under German occupation was a fractured society. At one extreme were the active collaborationists, the Vichy government under Marshal Pétain, which voluntarily cooperated with the occupiers in many aspects, including the deportation of Jews. At the other extreme were the active resistors, the maquisards, who risked their lives every day. And in the middle, the vast majority of the French population, who tried to survive, who helped or didn't help depending on the circumstances, and who lived with the constant fear of what could happen if they found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Maquis of southern France, where Das Reich operated before marching north, was a growing but also very heterogeneous force. There were communists, socialists, Gaullists, anarchists. There were young people fleeing the compulsory work service, the German system of forced labour that sent French workers to Germany. There were veterans of the Spanish Civil War who had crossed the Pyrenees and found a new battlefield in France. And there were simply patriots, people of all social and political conditions united by their rejection of the occupation. Maquis operations in the region where Das Reich was garrisoned in the spring of 1944 were increasingly bold. The 6th of June D-Day was the signal everyone had been waiting for. The BBC had been broadcasting coded messages to the French resistance. On the night of the 5th to the 6th of June, the verses of Verlaine sounded over the airwaves as a signal that the landing was imminent, and the Maquis responded. Mass sabotage of railway lines, telephone cables, fuel supplies. This activity made strategic sense. Every hour of delay in moving German reinforcements to Normandy was a valuable hour for the Allies. The British Special Operations Executive and the American Office of Strategic Services had been training and equipping the French resistance for years, for exactly this moment. And when the time came, the French resistance acted with remarkable coordination. But that same action provoked the response from Das Reich. And the response, as we have seen, was disproportionate in a way that went beyond any rational strategic calculation. On the 9th of June, the same day as the Toul hangings, the resistance captured Commander Kampf. This episode has never been completely clarified. It is not clear exactly where Kampf was captured, who captured him, or what exactly happened to him afterward. What does seem clear is that he was dead, or being held somewhere in the region, and that this capture was one of the factors that triggered the fury unleashed upon Oradour-sur-Glane. The story of Kampf is tragic on multiple levels. He was, according to all testimonies of his comrades, a charismatic and beloved officer. His loss was a personal blow for many in Das Reich, including Diekmann, who was his friend. And there are those who have argued that the massacre of Oradour-sur-Glane was, in part, an act of personal revenge by Diekmann for the capture of Kampfer, an outburst of emotion translated into massive violence against innocent civilians. But that explanation, even if it contains an element of truth, is not enough. Because Diekmann was not the only officer present that day. There were dozens of officers of varying ranks present at the operation. None of them refused. None of them tried to stop what was happening. None of them went looking for Lamadin to tell him that things had gone too far. The silence of all those uniformed witnesses is, in itself, a form of complicity. Let's return now to the question from the title. Why did Das Reich instill so much fear in France? What made it the unit most associated with brutality in the Western theatre of the war? The answer has, as we have seen, multiple layers. There is a historical layer. Das Reich was one of the first and most important divisions of the Waffen-SS, formed from the beginning with the intention of creating an ideological elite. There is a doctrinal layer, the policy of collective reprisals that was codified in SS orders and that Das Reich applied with particular intensity. There is an experiential layer. The years on the Eastern Front had transformed its soldiers into men capable of things that would have been unthinkable before the war. There is a leadership layer. Lamadin was a man who issued orders for collective reprisal without apparent moral reflection. And there is a layer that is perhaps the most disturbing of all, that of impunity. Das Reich committed its worst crimes in France because it could, because nobody stopped them, because the institutional culture of the SS made significant internal dissent impossible, because the German occupation of France provided the framework within which these actions could be committed without immediate consequences. And because, when consequences finally arrived in the form of post-war trials, those consequences were irregular, unsatisfactory, and in many cases non-existent. Lamadin died in his bed. Most of the participants in the massacre were never identified, tried, or condemned. The only major trial was that of Bordeaux in 1953, which ended in amnesty. This impunity sends a chilling message that crimes committed with enough systematicity, within a sufficiently chaotic context, by enough anonymous perpetrators within a sufficiently large organisation, can go unanswered, that justice has limits, and that those limits are frequently set not by principles but by political convenience. However, memory has not forgiven in the same way as the courts. Oradour-sur-Glane remains one of the most visited sites in France, a place where the past refuses to fade. The ruins of the village still stand, just as the soldiers of Das Reich left them on the 10th of June 1944. And every year, on that date, there are commemoration ceremonies, where survivors, descendants of victims, and French and European citizens gather to remember what happened and to affirm that it must never happen again. The Oradour-sur-Glane Memorial, inaugurated in 1999, added a historical context to the ruins, allowing visitors to understand not only what happened, but why, how it fits within the broader history of Nazi Germany and the Second World War. It is a remarkable example of how memory can become education, of how horror can be transformed into a lesson. But there is a dimension to this story that is frequently overlooked, that of the individual perpetrators, the soldiers who were there that day. Who were they? What happened to them after the war? What did they think of what they had done? The answers to these questions are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory. Some of the identified participants in the massacre denied their presence or minimized their involvement. Some claimed they were simply following orders, that they had no choice. Some showed signs of genuine remorse, although late remorse cannot undo the damage done, and some seemed to have lived the rest of their lives without what happened in Oradour-sur-Glane weighing on them in any visible way, which is perhaps the most disturbing thing of all. Studies on post-war atrocity perpetrators have revealed a disconcerting pattern: the human capacity to compartmentalize. The men who participated in massacres could go back home, get married, have children, lead apparently normal lives, without their everyday behavior revealing anything of what they had done. This capacity for compartmentalization does not excuse them, but it forces us to recognize an uncomfortable truth. Perpetrators of atrocities are not always recognizable as such. They do not carry visible marks. They are, in many ways, indistinguishable from the rest of humanity. And what does that say about us? About humanity in general? This is the question that social theorists, philosophers, and historians have spent decades trying to answer. What transforms ordinary people into participants in massacres? And how can we build systems and cultures that prevent that process of transformation from occurring? The most compelling research suggests that the most important factors are not individual but systemic. Ideological indoctrination that dehumanizes the other, institutional hierarchy that makes obedience a supreme virtue, peer pressure that penalizes dissent, impunity that eliminates the consequences of violence, and the situation of exceptionality that suspends ordinary moral norms. All these factors were present in Das Reich in an extreme way, and all those factors, in less extreme but recognizable forms, remain present in different contexts in the contemporary world. This is the reason why the history of Das Reich is not just history of the past, it is a warning about the present and the future. But I do not want to end this first part of our exploration by leaving Das Reich only on the plane of systemic abstraction, because there are individual stories within this collective history that deserve to be told with all the concreteness we can give them. One of those stories is that of Robert Hebrus. He was born in Oradour-sur-Glane in 1925. He was one of the young men of the village that 10th of June 1944, when the Das Reich soldiers arrived and ordered everyone to gather in the square. He was 19 years old. Hebrus was one of the men taken to the Lodi barn, one of the 6 sites where the men were locked up and massacred. When the soldiers opened fire, Hebrus fell wounded, not mortally. He lay among the bodies of his neighbours, his friends, his relatives, while the soldiers set fire to the barn. With his clothes smoking, taking advantage of the chaos, he managed to crawl toward a small opening in the barn wall and escape. He managed to hide in the bushes and wait while the village burned. Robert Hebrus survived, and for the rest of his long life, he dedicated a large part of his time and energy to testifying about what had happened that day. He spoke with students, with politicians, with journalists, with heads of state. He turned his survival into a mission to make sure that what happened in Oradour-sur-Glane was not forgotten. Hebrus died in February 2023 at 97 years old. He was the last adult survivor of the Oradour-sur-Glane massacre. His death was the end of something. There is no longer anyone alive who can say, "I was there that day." The direct witnesses are gone. What remains is transmitted memory, recorded testimonies, written books, filmed documentaries, and above all, the ruins of the village that the French government preserved as a permanent monument. Another story that deserves to be told is that of the children of Oradour-sur-Glane. Among the 642 victims of the massacre, 247 were children. Children of all ages, from months-old babies to teenagers of 15 or 16 years. The image of the dead children in a church, of the charred babies, is the one that has most lastingly remained etched in the collective memory of France and of Europe. Many of those children were not from Oradour-sur-Glane. That particular day, there were children in the village, from a school in Lorient, who were there on an excursion, fleeing the bombings they had suffered in their hometown. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, victims of a cruelty that did not even know the perverse logic of reprisal that the occupiers intended to apply. And the soldiers who killed those children, what went through their minds in that moment? There are testimonies, gathered by historians, in the subsequent years, from Das Reich soldiers, who claimed that what happened in Oradour-sur-Glane disturbed them deeply, that they couldn't sleep, that what they had seen haunted them, that they never forgot it. But there is also evidence of the contrary, of soldiers who seemed indifferent, who carried out orders without apparent anguish, who on the very day of the massacre ate normally, drank with their comrades, slept without visible problems. The variation in individual responses within a group that committed the same actions tells us something important about the heterogeneity of the psychological experience, even within a homogeneous institutional context. But none of those individual responses changes what happened. No degree of subsequent remorse can bring back the dead. And this is perhaps the hardest truth of the entire history of Das Reich, that there is nothing that can undo what was done, that the only possible response is to remember, understand, and work so that it never happens again. Now, before continuing with the second part of this history, which will explore in more detail the specific mechanisms of the SS reprisal doctrine, the post-war trials, the legacy of Das Reich in French and European collective memory, and the broader implications of this history for our understanding of how atrocities occur, I want to return to something I mentioned at the beginning, and that has probably been lingering with you ever since. You said at the beginning that you didn't know what those soldiers wanted. You didn't know why they were there. You only knew that your mother squeezed your hand with a strength she had never used before. That image, that child and that mother in the square of Oradour-sur-Glane is the image that should stay with us. Not the statistics, not the dates, not the names of the commanders, not the doctrinal complexities of the Waffen-SS reprisal policy. Those things are important to understand, but they are not the most important thing. The most important thing is that human, universal moment, a mother's fear, the hand squeezing the child's because there are no words to say what she is feeling, the instinct to protect the one you love when you cannot protect them from what is approaching. And then, in the case of that village, that 10th of June 1944, the rupture of everything that should be, the violence that should not be possible but was, the 642 people who did not return to their homes that night. How did we get here? How did we reach the point where that was possible? That is the question we have been answering, and that we will continue answering in the second part. But before that, let me stop you here so you can process everything we have seen, because there is much more to explore. There are aspects of the history of Das Reich that we have not yet touched on, that shed new light on the central question. And there are implications of this history that go far beyond 1944, that remain relevant today. The history of Das Reich did not end with Germany's surrender in May 1945. In a sense, the history of what Das Reich did never ended. The ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane are still there. The descendants of the victims are still alive. And the question of how it could happen remains urgent. To continue answering that question, we are going to need to explore more. The internal structure of Das Reich, the specific mechanisms of indoctrination, the individual profiles of the leaders, the legal context of the post-war period, and the long process of elaborating the collective memory that has transformed Oradour-sur-Glane into one of the most powerful symbols of the Second World War. There is also a dimension that is rarely mentioned in popular accounts of this history, that of the Germans within Das Reich, who resisted, who sabotaged, who refused, who maintained some degree of humanity within a system designed to destroy it. Those stories exist, even if they are in the minority. And they deserve to be told. And there is the story of the survivors, not only Marguerite Ruffensch and Robert Ebras, but the men and women who survived the Toul massacre, those who escaped deportation to concentration camps, those who lived to see the end of the war and had to rebuild their lives upon the ruins of what they had lost. All of that comes in the second part, and if you have made it this far, if the story has gripped you as I hoped it would, then you know the second part is going to be even more revealing. Before continuing, let me tell you something. What we are doing here, exploring this dark chapter of history with all the honesty and detail we can, is exactly what we must do. Not to revel in the horror, not to satisfy a morbid curiosity, but because understanding how these things happened is the only way to be on guard against their repetitions. Ignorance does not protect. Knowledge, even if it is painful, can do so. The ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane exist for that reason. The memorial exists for that reason, and this history exists for that reason. All right. We have already covered the first great stretch of this history. We have seen the origins of Das Reich in the SS Verfügungstruppe. We have followed the division through Poland, France, Yugoslavia, the Eastern Front, Kharkov and Kursk. We have reached southern France in the spring of 1944. We have seen the march north after D-Day, and we have explored in detail the massacres of Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane. We have examined the post-war processes and the impunity that largely prevailed, and we have begun to explore the deeper questions about how it is possible that all that occurred. But there is much more. The second part of this history is going to delve into aspects that we have only touched upon here. It is going to go further in the analysis of the mechanisms of indoctrination. It is going to explore the individual profiles of the Das Reich leaders in more detail. It is going to examine the post-war justice process more exhaustively, including the debates surrounding the Bordeaux trial of 1953 and its consequences. It is going to look at the legacy of Oradour-sur-Glane in French and European collective memory, and how that legacy has evolved over the decades. And it is going to explore the broader lessons of this history for our understanding of collective violence and its mechanisms. We are also going to explore something that surprises many, the history of how the memory of Das Reich was managed in post-war Germany, how veterans of the unit maintained associations, published memoirs, and contributed to the creation of a narrative that minimized or justified their actions, and how historians, journalists, and researchers fought for decades to counter that narrative with documented facts. Because the history of Das Reich is not only the history of what the unit did, it is also the history of how those facts were remembered, manipulated, suppressed, denied, and finally recognized. It is the story of the struggle between memory and oblivion, between justice and impunity, between truth and convenience. And the best starting point for that exploration is the man who designed the system, Heinrich Himmler. Himmler was born in Munich on the 7th of October 1899. He was the second of 3 children from a lower middle-class family, deeply Catholic and vaguely nationalist. His father was a school teacher, a serious and disciplined man who had minor connections with the Bavarian royal family. Heinrich grew up in an orderly, somewhat emotionally cold home, where obedience and performance were the paramount values. From childhood, Himmler was a diligent but not brilliant student. He was physically weak, with chronic stomach problems that would accompany him all his life. He was not athletic. His myopic eyes and his glasses gave him the appearance of an intellectual rather than a warrior. And yet, as a teenager, he developed an obsessive fascination with the ideas of chivalry, Germanic nobility, mysticism, and racial superiority that characterize what historian Richard Evans called the mental universe of Nazism. In the First World War, Himmler was too young to fight at the beginning of the conflict. When he was finally drafted in 1917, the war ended before he could reach the front. This frustration of not having fought, of having missed the great test of manhood and sacrifice that his generation saw in the war, marked him deeply. He compensated for that frustration with an obsessive dedication to the military and racial ideals that Nazism offered him as a substitute. After the war, Himmler studied agronomy, briefly and unsuccessfully. He worked as a fertilizer salesman, also without success. He joined the Nazi Party in 1923 and participated in the failed beer hall putsch in November of that year, although in a secondary role, and little by little he climbed within the party hierarchy until reaching, in 1929, the position that would transform his life and history, Reichsführer SS. What Himmler did with the SS from that moment on is one of the most fascinating and most chilling stories of institutional engineering in modern history. He had a fully formed vision in his mind of what he wanted the SS to be, and he worked with almost superhuman energy and meticulousness to realize it. Himmler's vision for the SS was imbued with an elaborate and, frankly, absurd mysticism that mixed pseudo-scientific racist ideas with imagery of medieval chivalry, ancient Germanic traditions, and fantasies of a racial elite destined to rule Europe and eventually the world. The SS were to be, in his conception, the core of the future Aryan state, the breeders of the master race, the guardians of German blood, the executors of the Führer's will. To materialize this vision, Himmler created a series of specific institutions and rituals. Wewelsburg Castle, in the Westphalia region, was purchased and extensively renovated as a kind of cathedral for the SS, a secular cult centre where ceremonies mixing Germanic pagan elements with military rituals were held. The Great Hall of the castle had 12 seats for the 12 supreme leaders of the SS arranged around a large round table in explicit reference to Arthurian legend. The walls were decorated with runes, sun symbols, and other elements of SS symbolism. This mystical religious dimension of the SS is crucial to understanding its power over its members. The SS were not simply a military or police organisation. They were a secular order with all the psychological attributes of a religious order: initiation rituals, sacred symbols, a total worldview that answered all important questions, a sense of belonging to something greater than the individual, and a loyalty that was demanded to be absolute, total, and unconditional. The SS rituals began at the moment of recruitment. Candidates were physically examined with a level of detail that bordered on the grotesque. Their body proportions were measured, their teeth were examined, their photographs were studied to determine their racial type. Their genealogies were checked several generations back to ensure there was no Jewish blood or racial contamination. This process, which could last weeks or months, had the psychological effect of making the candidate feel specially selected, specially pure, specially valuable. Before even putting on the uniform, the recruit had been convinced that he was superior. The oath that SS members swore to Hitler was different from the standard military oath. It was not an oath to Germany or to the Constitution, but a personal oath to Adolf Hitler, to his person, to his will. I swear to you, Adolf Hitler, loyalty and bravery. I vow obedience to you and the superiors you appoint, unto death, so help me God. This personal oath to the Führer had the effect of eliminating any mediation between the order and the obedience. There was no constitution, no law, no conventional morality standing between Hitler's will and the actions of the SS members. Obedience was direct, personal, and absolute. Ideological indoctrination in the SS was constant and systematic. It was not limited to formal class hours. It permeated the entire life of the unit. The songs, the marches, the nocturnal rituals, the readings in the mess halls, the guided conversations by political officers. Everything was a vector for transmitting the message, and the message was always the same in its essential elements: the superiority of the Aryan race, the mortal threat of international Judaism, the historical mission of the German people, the need for a racially pure state, the greatness of the struggle to which they had been called. For the young recruits, many of them teenagers coming from families with Nazi sympathies, or who simply knew no other narrative of the world, because they had grown up in the Nazi educational system, this message had a powerful resonance. They did not receive it as propaganda, because they had no alternative frame of reference to evaluate it. They received it as truth, as the real world as it is. And in the context of Germany's defeat in the First World War, the resentment of the Treaty of Versailles, the economic crisis, and the national humiliation they had lived through as children or heard from their parents, that message of racial grandeur and historical mission was intoxicating. Within the SS Verfügungstruppe, which would be the core of what Das Reich became, the indoctrination had an additional layer, preparation for what Himmler called the hard tasks. This was the euphemistic way of referring to the actions the SS would carry out against the enemies of the people, Jews, communists, political opponents, everyone classified as threats to the purity and security of the Reich. The soldiers were told they would have to do difficult things that would produce suffering that might seem cruel. But they were assured that those things were necessary, that they were the price of greatness, that truly strong men did not let themselves be weakened by compassion toward enemies. This preparation for toughness had a very concrete effect. It preconditioned the soldiers to accept violence against civilians as something not only possible but virtually mandatory under the right circumstances. When the time came to carry out a reprisal, to execute hostages, to burn a village, the soldiers did not need to be convinced that it was right. They had already been convinced beforehand. They only needed someone to tell them that the appropriate circumstances had arrived. There is a text that Himmler wrote, which is extraordinarily revealing of this mentality. In a speech to SS officers in October 1943 in Posen, which was recorded and has survived, Himmler spoke about the extermination of the Jews with a bluntness that left no room for any ambiguous interpretation. He described the massacres as a glorious page of our history that has never been written and never will be written. He spoke of the toughness of the task, of how difficult it was for the good men of the SS to carry out such an action. And then he said something key, that the men who did it must emerge from that experience without having hardened outwardly, without having lost their capacity for love and compassion toward their own family and their own people. In other words, they could be ruthless with enemies and tender with their own. They could compartmentalize. This was, in essence, the psychological recipe of the SS. Systematic compartmentalization, the ability to act with extreme brutality in one context and maintain a sense of normality and decency in another. And this recipe worked, at least in the sense that it produced men capable of committing the atrocities they committed. Now, to understand Das Reich specifically, we need to look in more detail at the leaders who moulded the division in its formative years and who were in command during its darkest moments. The first major commander of what would become Das Reich was Paul Hauser, the same man who would lead the SS Panzer Corps in the Third Battle of Kharkov. Hauser deserves careful analysis because he is a figure that Waffen-SS apologists frequently use to argue that not everyone in the SS were Nazi fanatics, that there were among them professional soldiers who simply served their country. Hauser was born in Brandenburg in 1880. He was a generation older than most SS leaders. He had had a distinguished career in the Imperial German Army, reaching the rank of Lieutenant General before the end of the First World War. After the war, he served briefly in the Reichswehr, the army of the Weimar Republic, before retiring in 1932. Hauser's decision to join the SS in 1934, 2 years after retiring, has been the subject of much historical debate. His defenders argue that it was primarily motivated by career opportunities and the possibility of once again exercising the military command he knew how to do. His critics point out that by then the character of the Nazi regime was perfectly clear to anyone who wanted to see it, and that joining the SS in 1934 was a decision that could not be made in ignorance of what the organisation represented. What is clear is that Hauser was a brilliant military officer and an exceptional organiser. It was he who turned the SS Verfügungstruppe from an enthusiastic but poorly trained collection of guards into a coherent and effective military force. He introduced rigorous training standards. He insisted on a clear command structure and solid tactical doctrines. In many ways, he was the military architect of what the Waffen-SS would become. But Hauser was also part of the system. He issued orders that resulted in the deaths of civilians. He participated in the institutional culture that made those deaths possible. And after the war, he was one of the most active leaders in creating the apologetic narrative of the Waffen-SS. The idea that the Waffen-SS were simply soldiers like any others, that they had nothing to do with the atrocities of the Holocaust, that they were unfairly equated with the security SS who carried out the crimes. This narrative, which was actively promoted by Waffen-SS veterans in the post-war decades, has been refuted in detail by historians, but had a real impact on popular perception and on the willingness of German courts to prosecute Waffen-SS veterans. Hauser died in 1972 at the age of 91, without ever having been tried for any crime. The second major leader associated with Das Reich who deserves attention is Wilhelm Bittrich, who commanded the division at various stages of the war. Bittrich was, in many ways, the prototype of the first generation Waffen-SS officer, militarily talented, ideologically committed to Nazism, but in a more pragmatic than fanatical way, and capable of cold brutality when circumstances demanded it. Bittrich was born in 1894 and also had experience in the Imperial Army before joining the SS. In the context of Das Reich, his name is associated with the Wormhaupt massacre of 1940, which we mentioned at the beginning of our story. He was also the commander of Das Reich during the Battle of Arnhem in September 1944, one of the best-known episodes of the Western European campaign, where the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which Bittrich commanded, defeated the Allied airborne Operation Market Garden. At Arnhem, Bittrich showed something that surprised many, a certain sense of conventional military honour. After the captured Allied troops were brought before him, he insisted that they be treated according to the Geneva Conventions, which was unusual in the context of SS practices. Some historians point to this behaviour at Arnhem as evidence that Bittrich was different from the worst elements of the SS. But these moments of relatively conventional behaviour do not erase the complete picture. Bittrich was also responsible for orders that resulted in the death of prisoners and civilians in other contexts. The complexity of his figure is representative of the broader complexity of the history of the Waffen-SS. There was no single template describing all its members. There was individual variation within an institutional culture that tolerated and sometimes demanded atrocity. The third central leader for our story is the aforementioned Heinz Lammerdin, commander of Das Reich during the march to Normandy and the crimes of Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane. Lammerdin deserves a more detailed analysis than we have given him so far. He was born in Dortmund in 1905. He was an engineer by training, graduated from the Technical University of Munich. He joined the SS relatively late, in 1935, when the regime was already firmly established. He rose within the SS first, in administrative and staff roles before moving to combat command. On the Eastern Front, he served in various staff positions that gave him a detailed understanding of the anti-partisan doctrine the SS applied in occupied territories. The crucial point about Lammerdin, the point that makes him so important to understanding what happened in France in June 1944, is that he was not a particularly passionate ideologue. He was a technician, a manager, someone who saw problems in terms of efficiency and effectiveness. For him, reprisal against the civilian population was not an act of racist hatred or personal cruelty. It was an order management tool. It was what the SS manuals said had to be done in the face of partisan resistance. It was, in his cold logic, the rational answer to the problem the Maquis presented. This technocratic coldness is, in a sense, more disturbing than ideological fanaticism. The fanatic at least acts from a conviction, however perverse it may be. The technocrat acts from a logic that has neutralized moral conviction and replaced it with a calculus of efficiency. Lammerdin did not hate the inhabitants of Toul or Oradour-sur-Glane. He simply did not see them as people whose lives had a moral weight opposing the objectives of his mission. This technocratic mentality was, in fact, highly representative of an important stratum of Nazi leadership. Not all the criminals of the Third Reich were Hitlers, obsessed with racial hatred. Many of them were Lammerdins, competent professionals who put their skills at the service of a criminal system without asking too many questions about the justice of what they were doing. Men who could have been excellent engineers, doctors, lawyers, or administrators in a different society, and who in Nazi Germany put those same capabilities at the service of crime. Lamadin's post-war is, as we have already said, a story of almost complete impunity. After the German defeat, he was briefly captured by the Allies, but released. He returned to West Germany where he settled as a construction entrepreneur. The French authorities demanded his extradition and condemned him in absentia in 1951, but the West German authorities consistently refused to extradite him, arguing that the in absentia conviction was not valid under German law and that there were insufficient legal grounds for extradition. This refusal by West Germany to extradite Lamadin was one of the most painful episodes in post-war Franco-German relations. For the families of the victims of Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane, it was a betrayal. For the German authorities, it was a political convenience in a period when the new Federal Republic was trying to integrate its population, including the numerous ex-members of the party and the Nazi armed forces, into the new democratic order. The German argument was that prosecuting war criminals disturbed national reconciliation, that the German people had already suffered sufficiently with the war, and that it was necessary to look toward the future instead of the past. This argument has a certain political logic, but it ignores a fundamental truth, that authentic reconciliation cannot be built on the silence of injustice. A society that does not confront its crimes does not overcome them, it buries them. And what is buried eventually surfaces sooner or later. And in Germany, indeed, it surfaced. The 60s and 70s saw a revival of interest in the crimes of the Third Reich, driven in part by younger generations who had not lived through the war and who asked uncomfortable questions of their parents and grandparents. The trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, which was followed by millions of people worldwide via television, was a turning point. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials, from 1963 to 65, where some of the perpetrators of Auschwitz were judged, was another. And little by little, German society began the painful process of confronting what its previous generation had done. This process was slower and more incomplete regarding the Waffen-SS than regarding other dimensions of Nazi crime, partly because the apologetic narrative that Hauser and other veterans had built was persuasive to many, partly because the Waffen-SS had fought on all fronts of Europe and its personnel were distributed throughout post-war German society, and partly because the Cold War created political pressures that favoured forgetting the complicities of the past rather than examining them. But let's return to the period that concerns us, to the context of Das Reich in France, to explore something that the grand narratives of history often omit, the voices of the French who lived through the occupation and who experienced firsthand what it was like to coexist with the soldiers of Das Reich. The German occupation of France began in June 1940 and lasted until the liberation in 1944. 4 years. 4 years in which millions of French people lived under the rules, controls, restrictions, and threats of the occupier. And in southern France, in the area where Das Reich was garrisoned in the months before D-Day, that coexistence had particular characteristics. In the theory of Nazi occupation, the French were in an ambiguous position. On the one hand, France was a defeated nation that had to be economically exploited. Its factories produced for the Reich. Its food fed the German army. Its workers were sent to labour in the factories of Germany. On the other hand, the French were considered racially closer to the Germans than the Slavs or the Jews, which meant that the occupation of France was to be in principle softer than that of Poland or the Soviet Union. In practice, that theoretical difference translated into a series of restrictions and controls that made life difficult, but not, for the majority of the French, immediately life-threatening. You had to carry identity documents, register with the authorities, respect curfews, endure the rationing of food and fuel, tolerate the presence of German soldiers in cafes, hotels, theatres, and streets. But for some categories of people, the occupation was much more than a nuisance. For French Jews, who were subjected to increasingly restrictive anti-Semitic laws, and who from 1942 began to be deported en masse to extermination camps, the occupation was a death sentence. For communists and other political opponents, it was the constant threat of the Gestapo. And for the young men who were approaching the age of mobilization for the compulsory work service, it was the prospect of being sent to work in bombed-out Germany, far from their families and in conditions of semi-slavery. It was precisely this compulsory work service, established in September 1942, that massively fueled the growth of the Maquis. When the Vichy regime began sending forced labourers to Germany, thousands of young Frenchmen opted to flee to the woods and mountains rather than obey. They joined existing resistance groups or formed new ones. And so, paradoxically, the German policy of extracting forced labour created the armed resistance that would do so much damage to German logistics. In southern France, the terrain was favourable for guerrilla warfare. The Limousin region, the Périgord, the Auvergne, the Pyrenees. All these territories with their wooded valleys, their mountains, and their scarce roads were difficult for occupying forces to control. The Maquisards knew the terrain of a lifetime. The Germans did not. And when Das Reich arrived in that region for its period of reorganisation and training in the spring of 1944, it encountered a situation that its leaders perceived as hostile. The local population held attitudes that ranged from active collaboration with the Germans to active support for the resistance, passing through the majority who tried to stay out of everything. But even this calculated neutrality was perceived by the Das Reich soldiers, trained in SS ideology, as a kind of passive complicity with the enemy. If you are not with us, you are against us. This binary logic, so characteristic of totalitarian systems, left no room for genuine neutrality. Everyday relations between Das Reich soldiers and the civilian population in southern France, in the months leading up to D-Day, have been documented in diaries, memoirs, and oral testimonies collected by historians like Max Hastings, Jean-Jacques Fouché, and others. What emerges from these sources is a complex and disturbing picture. There were soldiers who made efforts to maintain normal relations with French civilians, who bought from local markets, who exchanged conversations with shopkeepers, who occasionally showed gestures of courtesy or even sympathy. There were also, it must be said, romantic or sexual relationships between German soldiers and French women, some consensual, some under various forms of pressure or coercion, which would be the subject of the infamously celebrated head shavings of the horizontal collaborationists upon liberation. But beneath this surface of apparent normality, there was constant tension. Das Reich soldiers knew they could be attacked at any moment by the Maquis. Ambushes, shots from the shadows, explosions on the roads. All this created a permanent state of alert and mistrust that coloured every interaction with civilians. The farmer selling his products in the market could also be the one keeping weapons for the partisans in his hayloft. The shopkeeper serving wine to the German soldiers could also be the one reporting their movements to the resistance. This uncertainty, this inability to distinguish the innocent civilian from the resistance collaborator, was a perfect breeding ground for paranoia and preventive violence. And the Das Reich leaders responded to that uncertainty with the only tool they knew well, collective reprisal. If we cannot identify the individual culprit, we will hold the community responsible. If we cannot punish the partisan, we will punish those who might have housed, fed, or informed him. This logic, which violated all principles of international humanitarian law, was perfectly consistent with the doctrine that Das Reich had applied on the Eastern Front and had adopted as second nature. In the months leading up to D-Day, there were multiple incidents in the southern region of France where Das Reich troops took reprisals against civilians for resistance activities. Records of these incidents are incomplete, but investigators have documented civilian executions, mass detentions, destruction of properties in numerous towns across the region. Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane were the most severe and most well-known incidents, but they were not the only ones. There is an aspect of the Oradour-sur-Glane massacre that requires more detailed exploration, the question of whether there was a mix-up of towns. This theory, which we have already mentioned briefly, has been the subject of historiographical debate for decades. According to this theory, the original target of the operation on the 10th of June 1944 was Oradour-sur-Viresse, a different village that did have a history associated with the local maquis. The name Oradour was relatively common in the region, and there would have been a confusion between the two locations. Dijkman would have arrived at the wrong village, and since he was already there and had gathered the population, he decided to proceed anyway. This theory has some circumstantial support. The relative absence of known resistance activity in Oradour-sur-Glane and the similarity of names between the two locations, but most historians consider it unsatisfactory as a complete explanation for several reasons. First, even if there was an initial confusion of locations, that does not explain the massacre. If Dijkman arrived at the wrong village and gathered its inhabitants, the next logical step would be to verify the village's identity and withdraw or conduct a normal inspection. The decision to massacre the entire population cannot be explained by a navigation error. Second, Lamardine's orders issued on the 9th of June, which we mentioned earlier, explicitly stated that villages from which those responsible for attacks on German soldiers originated were to be burned. This order, if communicated to Dijkman, could have been interpreted as authorization for what he did, regardless of whether he was in the correct village or not. Third, the level of systematization of the massacre, the way women and children were separated and taken to the church, the way the men were divided into groups and taken to different buildings, the way the fires were organized. All this suggests that the massacre was planned, not improvised in a moment of confusion. It does not seem like the behavior of someone who has just realized they are in the wrong village. The most probably correct explanation is also the most disturbing, that Dijkman arrived in Oradour-sur-Glane with the intention of carrying out a large-scale reprisal, that this intention fell within the doctrinal framework of Das Reich, and that the massacre was a deliberate decision, not accidental. The possibility that there was initial confusion about the exact location does not change that fundamental analysis. There is also the question of the role the capture of Sturmbannführer Kampfer might have played. This episode, which we have already mentioned, remains one of the most mysterious aspects of the entire story. Kampfer was captured on the 9th of June, the day before the massacre, somewhere in the region. What exactly happened to him has never been clarified with certainty. Some versions say he was murdered by his captors shortly after capture. Others say he was held prisoner briefly before being executed. There are even versions suggesting he might have survived briefly. What we do know is that Kampfer's capture was known in Das Reich on that very 9th of June, and that Dijkman, who was a personal friend of Kampf, learned of this capture. The relationship between Kampfer's disappearance and Dijkman's decision to proceed with the Oradour-sur-Glane massacre can never be established with certainty, but the temporal correlation is undeniable. What this suggests is something psychologists who study group violence know well, that mass reprisals are rarely the product of a single factor. They are the result of the convergence of multiple elements, the institutional doctrine that makes them possible and presents them as legitimate, the context of stress and threat that makes them seem urgent, and sometimes the individual emotional factor that makes someone pull the trigger at a specific moment. In the case of Oradour-sur-Glane, the Das Reich reprisal doctrine, the context of the march to Normandy and the active maquis, and possibly Dijkman's personal fury over the capture of his friend Kampf, converged on that June day with catastrophic consequences. Now, there is a dimension of this story that requires us to step out of the Das Reich theatre of operations and look at the broader picture of the war in France during that period. Because what happened in Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in the context of an entire country struggling for its liberation, where enormously disparate forces clashed in a space that was simultaneously a military battlefield and a theatre for a much more intimate war, the war between occupiers and occupied, between collaborationists and resistors, between those hoping to survive quietly and those gambling their lives in the resistance. France, in June 1944, was a country on the verge of transformation. The Vichy government, which since 1940 had actively collaborated with the occupiers, was in its final months. The Normandy landing had made liberation inevitable, although no one knew exactly when it would arrive. And in that transition period, violence from all sides intensified. The Germans increased reprisals, the resistance increased sabotages, and within French society itself, tensions between collaborationists and resistors reached moments of reckoning that in some cases took the form of private violence. The Maquis of southern France, which had kept a relatively low profile for years, for reasons of survival, was encouraged by D-Day to act with new audacity. The Toul uprising was part of that wave of audacity. The intention was to liberate departmental capitals, establish provisional administrations, and create free zones that could be connected with the Allied armies when they reached the interior. But this strategy had a fatal flaw. The Allies were still bogged down in Normandy, hundreds of kilometres away. The French Liberation Army would not reach the centre of the country for months, and meanwhile the Germans remained present and willing to respond to any uprising with a ferocity proportional to the threat they perceived. The tragedy of Toul is that the Maquis uprising was large enough to provoke the German reprisal, but not strong enough to resist it. The Maquisards took the city, held control for 24 hours, and then had to retreat upon the arrival of Das Reich. And the citizens of Toul paid the price for that moment of fleeting liberty, with the bodies of 99 of their neighbours hanging from the balconies of their city. Was it a tactical error by the Maquis? This is a debate that historians of the French resistance have maintained for decades. The question of whether the premature uprising in Toul was an irresponsible decision that endangered the civilian population is legitimate, but asking it without recognising the broader moral context is dangerous, because it runs the risk of placing the moral responsibility for the reprisal on the victims of the Maquis instead of on the German perpetrators. The truth is that the responsibility for what happened in Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane lies with Das Reich and only with Das Reich. The Maquis had the right to fight the occupation. The military actions of the Maquis, although they could be debated in tactical terms, were legitimate combat against an illegitimate occupation. What was not legitimate, what was and is a war crime, was Das Reich's response, the execution of non-combatant civilians as collective reprisal. That said, it is also true that the Maquis' tactical decisions had human consequences that its leaders should have better foreseen. War is a context where decisions have consequences that go beyond immediate military objectives, and leaders of any force fighting in an environment where reprisal against civilians is a documented reality have a responsibility to take that reality into account in their decisions. There are testimonies from Maquis leaders who expressed profound remorse for the consequences of their actions, who spent the rest of their lives carrying the burden that their actions contributed, albeit indirectly, to the suffering of their compatriots. This remorse is not a moral condemnation, but it is an expression of the ethics of responsibility that distinguishes those who make life or death decisions from those who simply obey orders. Let's return now to Das Reich's march toward Normandy, because there are aspects of that march that we have not yet explored sufficiently, and that shed light on the nature of the unit in that critical period. The Das Reich division began its movement north between the 8th and the 10th of June 1944, after the crimes of Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane. The column that had to travel approximately 700 kilometres of secondary and main roads to reach the Normandy front faced obstacles of all kinds. Sabotages by the Maquis and Allied special forces had cut or damaged multiple railway lines in southern and central France, forcing the division to move mainly by road, and moving by road during the day was extremely dangerous, because Allied fighter bombers, mainly American Republic P-47 Thunderbolts and British Hawker Typhoons, constantly patrolled looking for vehicle columns to attack. Air attacks on Das Reich columns during the march caused significant losses. Tanks, trucks, towed artillery, supply vehicles, everything was destroyed by the bombs and machine guns of Allied aircraft. The soldiers quickly learned to scatter as soon as they heard the roar of an airplane engine. The march that should have taken 3 or 4 days turned into an ordeal that lasted more than 2 weeks. During that march, tensions within the division manifested in revealing ways. Eastern Front veterans, accustomed to a war where civilian life had little value, tended to see any resistance or delay as justification for violence. The youngest recruits, some of whom were experiencing their first taste of real combat, reacted in more unpredictable ways, some with a brutality intended to prove they were up to the veteran standards, others with a confusion and fear that sometimes also translated into violence. And then there were the Alsatians, those young men forcibly incorporated, whose situation was absolutely tragic. Many of them did not speak German fluently, or did so with an accent that betrayed them as outsiders within a unit that valued homogeneity. They were in an SS division, whose ideology many of them did not share. They were fighting against Frenchmen who were, in many ways, their compatriots, and they had no option to refuse, because desertion in the SS was punished by death, not only of the deserter, but potentially of his family in Alsace. The testimony of the Das Reich Alsatians is one of the most extraordinary and painful bodies of testimony that exists concerning the Second World War. Men who for decades had to carry the stigma of having belonged to a division that committed the massacres of Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane. Men who in some cases participated in those massacres under coercion. Men who returned to a liberated Alsace and found themselves pointed out with the finger. To some of their compatriots, they were traitors, while to the families of the victims of Oradour-sur-Glane, they were criminals. The complexity of their situation was such that the Bordeaux judicial process, which included them as defendants alongside the German members of Das Reich, was seen in Alsace as a profound injustice. The debate over the Das Reich Alsatians has not been completely closed to this day. In 2012, French President François Hollande and German President Joachim Gauck met in Oradour-sur-Glane in a symbolic act of reconciliation. It was the first time a German president visited the site. Gauck bowed before the memorial and spoke words, acknowledging German responsibility. It was a powerful and necessary moment, though also late. But the question about the Alsatians, about the Malgreneurs, who were forced into the SS and who found themselves in that village on the 10th of June 1944, remains a not completely healed wound. Because their history illustrates something fundamental about the nature of crimes committed under institutional coercion, that the victims of a system can also become perpetrators when that system places them in impossible situations, and that justice, when trying to respond to those situations, can rarely achieve the moral precision demanded by the complexity of reality. In the Normandy of June and July 1944, Das Reich found the type of war for which it was best prepared: high-intensity combat against organised military forces. Here, outside the context of reprisal against civilians, the division showed the tactical capabilities that made it one of the most feared units in the German army. The Norman Bocage is a landscape that whoever has seen it does not easily forget. It is a region of small square fields, surrounded by dense, tall hedgerows, sometimes several metres high, growing on earthen embankments. The roads crisscrossing the Bocage are narrow, with hedgerows on both sides creating green tunnels, where visibility is limited to a few metres. For Allied tanks accustomed to the open spaces of North Africa or the plains of southern Italy, the Bocage was a tactical nightmare. Das Reich arrived in the Bocage in deteriorated conditions after the march, but with enough combat capacity to inflict serious losses on the Allies. Its tank battalions, including the Panzer IVs and the powerful Panther Vs, demonstrated time and time again that in the rugged terrain of the Bocage, where Allied armour could not use its numerical superiority effectively, the German tanks were formidable adversaries. The battles around Saint-Lô and the road between that city and Perrier were some of the most brutal combats on the Western Front. The Americans of the First Army, under the command of General Omar Bradley, advanced inch by inch, paying a massive price for every conquered field. Das Reich and other German divisions defended with a tenacity that disconcerted Allied planners, who had expected a faster breakthrough. One of the most documented episodes of Das Reich in Normandy was the combat around the village of Greynes in late June 1944. A small force of American paratroopers from the 5th Battalion of the 5th Regiment of the 82nd Airborne Division had positioned themselves in that village during the initial chaos of D-Day. When Das Reich troops arrived and assaulted the village, they took wounded American prisoners and subsequently executed them, along with some French civilians, including 2 priests. This incident was carefully documented after the war and is one of the multiple examples of the treatment Das Reich gave to prisoners of war, even in the Western theatre. On the 20th of July 1944, something occurred that changed the situation across Germany and potentially within Das Reich itself: the assassination attempt against Hitler at the Wolf's Lair. A group of army officers, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, planted a bomb in Hitler's meeting and detonated the explosive with the hope of killing the dictator, overthrowing the regime and negotiating peace with the Western Allies. The bomb exploded. Hitler survived, with injuries and hearing damage but alive. The conspiracy was crushed quickly. Stauffenberg and the core conspirators were shot that same night. In the following weeks, the Gestapo unravelled the network of the conspiracy, arresting thousands of people and executing several hundreds of them, including some of the most distinguished generals of the German army. How did Das Reich react to the attack? The available records suggest that the reaction within the division was one of genuine indignation by many of its members. The personal loyalty to Hitler that they had sworn was profound and was reinforced by years of indoctrination. The idea that army officers had tried to kill the Führer was, for many SS soldiers, a confirmation of their long-standing distrust toward the Wehrmacht and its old guard officers. The assassination attempt also had the effect of strengthening the power of the SS relative to the army. Himmler was appointed commander of the replacement army, the reserve force that organised training and casualty replacement for the entire German army. This appointment gave the SS unprecedented control over the mobilisation and training process of the entire army, not just the Waffen-SS. It was the peak of Himmler's power within the Nazi state. For Das Reich, this meant that in the final months of the war, the unit received reinforcements and resources with a priority it might not have received before. But the general context of the war was so unfavourable for Germany that not even this priority could reverse the fundamental trend. Operation Cobra, launched by General Patton's Third Army on the 25th of July 1944, finally broke the German front in Normandy. American armour poured into the interior of France with a speed that no German defence could contain, and Das Reich, along with other divisions of Army Group B, found itself trapped in the Falaise Pocket. The Falaise Pocket, which closed in August 1944, was for the Western Front the greatest German military disaster. 50,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. 10,000 died in combat inside the pocket and during escape attempts. The equipment destroyed was incalculable. Thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, massive amounts of supplies. The few thousand Das Reich soldiers who managed to escape the Falaise Pocket did so in desperate conditions, crossing the Dives River under constant Allied fire, sometimes swimming, sometimes on improvised rafts, leaving behind all the equipment they could not carry personally. The division that had marched to Normandy a few weeks earlier, with hundreds of tanks and thousands of vehicles, emerged from Falaise practically on foot. The retreat across France and then Belgium and the Netherlands was another ordeal. The Allies advanced so fast that they often cut off retreat routes before German units could use them. Paris was liberated on the 25th of August, Brussels the 3rd of September, Antwerp the 4th of September. In 3 weeks, the Allies advanced more than in the previous 3 months. For Das Reich, the retreat ended in September 1944, when the remnants of the division crossed the German border and regrouped for their reconstruction. The division that for 4 years had fought in all theatres of operations of Nazi Germany needed to be reconstituted from almost zero. And here we arrive at one of the most fascinating and revealing aspects of the history of the German army in the Second World War, its extraordinary capacity for regeneration. Despite losses that would have destroyed any other army, the Wehrmacht and the Waffen-SS remained capable of reconstituting units and throwing them back into combat. This capability rested partly on German bureaucratic efficiency, partly on ideological indoctrination that maintained morale even in desperate situations, and partly on the cadre system, the practice of maintaining the core of experienced officers and non-commissioned officers even when the troops were decimated, so they could transfer their experience and culture to new recruits. Das Reich was reconstituted between September and November 1944 in the Koblenz area in western Germany. It received new tanks, including an allocation of the latest Panther Vs and some Tiger IIs. It received new recruits, many of them very young or very old. The age limits, both minimum and maximum, had been extended as the war consumed the generations. And it received some veterans transferred from disbanded units or from hospitals where they had recovered from their wounds. This period of reconstruction was also a period of intensified indoctrination, especially after the July assassination attempt. The SS responded to the attack with a reaffirmation of unconditional loyalty to the Führer. Political speeches multiplied. References to the treason of the army officers became a constant theme, and the idea that Germany was now fighting an existential war, that it either won or was completely destroyed, was presented with a new urgency aiming to galvanize the recruits. Did that indoctrination work with the young recruits arriving at Das Reich in the autumn of 1944? The evidence is contradictory. Some of those young men, especially those who had grown up completely within the Hitler Youth system, showed a fanaticism that impressed even the cynical veterans. Others, who could remember a pre-Nazi Germany, or who came from less ideologically committed families, were more sceptical, but equally incapable of expressing that doubt in an institutional context that tolerated no dissent. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944 was, as we noted, Hitler's last great offensive gamble. The idea of Himmler and the German General Staff was to exploit the defensive superiority the SS had demonstrated throughout the war, but now in an offensive context that would take the Allies by surprise. In the Ardennes, Das Reich operated in the Bastogne sector, the city that would become the most enduring symbol of American resistance during that battle. General Anthony McAuliffe's famous reply to the German surrender ultimatum, a single word, nuts, has become military legend. But behind that legend were days of brutal combat in extreme cold conditions, with temperatures regularly dropping below minus 20 degrees Celsius, with deep snow making tank movement off-road impossible, and with Allied air superiority that, as soon as the weather cleared, shifted the balance of the battle decisively. Das Reich fought in the Ardennes with its characteristic mix of tactical skill and occasional brutality. On the 31st of December 1944, Das Reich soldiers executed several American prisoners in an incident that was investigated after the war, but which, like so many others, did not result in convictions. The culture of impunity continued to function. The Ardennes offensive was halted around mid-January 1945. The Allied counter-offensive recovered all lost ground and more, and Das Reich was transferred again, this time to the Eastern Front, where the situation was desperate. The final months of Das Reich on the Eastern Front are a story of continuous retreat under a Soviet pressure that offered no respite. The division fought in Hungary, where the German attempt to break the Soviet siege of Budapest failed bloodily. It fought in Austria, in the Eastern Alps, contesting every kilometre of ground the Soviets advanced, and in the early days of May 1945, with Berlin already in Soviet hands and Hitler dead in his bunker, Das Reich accepted its final surrender to American forces in Austria. On the 8th of May 1945, the war in Europe ended. Das Reich ceased to exist as a combat unit. Its members became prisoners of war, to be interrogated by the Allies, to try to rebuild their lives in a ruined Germany. And what happened then? What kind of people did the members of Das Reich become in the post-war period? This is one of the most disturbing questions, and also one of the most important, of this entire story. The answer, in general terms, is that they became ordinary people. The majority of the soldiers and officers of Das Reich returned to civilian life in post-war West Germany. Some found work in the same industries or professions they had held before the war. Some became farmers, carpenters, mechanics, merchants. Some started families, had children and grandchildren. Some lived to advanced ages, like their contemporaries, who had had completely peaceful careers. A small minority was tried and convicted for war crimes. A somewhat larger number was investigated, but never prosecuted for various reasons: lack of evidence, death of witnesses, statute of limitations, political decisions not to pursue, and the vast majority was never subjected to any kind of judicial process. In the early post-war years, the surviving Waffen-SS veterans found themselves in a complicated social position. The SS had been declared a criminal organisation by the Nuremberg Tribunal in 1946, making every one of its members theoretically susceptible to prosecution. In practice, however, the application of this declaration was very irregular. The Nuremberg trials had established the principle that individuals could be held criminally responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity, even when acting under orders of a state authority. This principle was revolutionary in the history of international law, but its application quickly met limits, both political and logistical. The Western Allies, as the Cold War intensified, had less and less interest in prosecuting ex-Nazis who could be useful in the new confrontation with the Soviet Union. Some Nazi scientists, notably rocket specialists like Wernher von Braun, were actively recruited by the Americans. Some former Nazi intelligence agents were incorporated into Western intelligence services, and generally the pressure for denazification yielded to the pressure for building a strong West Germany allied against the Soviet bloc. In this context, Waffen-SS veterans were able to reintegrate into civilian society with relative ease, but they were not merely passive in that process, they were active. They organised veterans associations, the so-called HIAG, Mutual Help Association of former Waffen-SS members, which functioned as political lobbying groups, mutual support networks, and narrative production machines. The narrative these associations promoted was consistent and well constructed. The Waffen-SS, they argued, were essentially a fourth branch of the German armed forces, regular soldiers fighting as soldiers in all theatres of war, indistinguishable in their behaviour from Wehrmacht soldiers. Yes, there had been excesses, but excesses were committed by specific units, specific individuals, in specific contexts, not by the Waffen-SS as an institution. And in any case, all military forces in war committed excesses. Pointing out those of the Waffen-SS, while ignoring those of the Allies, was hypocrisy. This argument had some elements of truth intermixed with profound falsehoods. It was true that the Waffen-SS had fought in conventional combat. It was true that the Allies had also committed war crimes. It was true that some individuals within the Waffen-SS behaved in some contexts, within the bounds of legitimate conventional combat. But it was profoundly false that the Waffen-SS was just a fourth branch, with no connection to the crimes of the regime. The Waffen-SS and the Security SS were part of the same organisation under Himmler's same command. They shared the same ideology, the same institutional culture, the same values. The members of the Waffen-SS had sworn personal loyalty to Hitler, not to Germany, and the crimes committed by Waffen-SS units, including Das Reich in Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane, were not individual aberrations. They were the systematic product of an institution designed from its inception to act outside the conventional rules of war. This apologetic narrative of the Waffen-SS veterans was actively fought by historians, journalists, and human rights activists for decades. Figures like Simon Wiesenthal, the Austrian Nazi hunter who survived the Holocaust, dedicated their lives to pursuing war criminals and countering narratives that minimized or denied the crimes. The rigorous historical investigations of Christopher Browning, Omer Bartov, Richard Evans, Anthony Beaver, and many others systematically demolished the apologetic defences with irrefutable documentation. In the specific case of Das Reich and the crimes of Toul and Oradour-sur-Glane, the work of French and international researchers was crucial to establishing the facts with precision. Max Hastings' book, Das Reich, The March of the 2nd Panzer Division Through France, published in 1981, was one of the first works to systematically examine Das Reich's march from Montauban to Normandy, combining German, French, and Allied sources to reconstruct the events. Hastings' work helped break the silence surrounding many aspects of that history. The work of French researchers like Jean-Jacques Fauche, who published a monumental study on the Oradour-sur-Glane massacre, added layers of detail that completed the picture. Fouché and his colleagues managed to identify a significant number of participants in the massacre, establish the chain of command with greater detail than any previous work, and reconstruct the events of June 10th with a chronological precision that left little room for apologetic narratives. The question of justice for Oradour-sur-Glane had a late and unexpected chapter. In 2012, Heinz Barth, a former Das Reich officer who had participated in the Oradour-sur-Glane massacre as a unit sub-commander, died in Germany. Barth had been tried in 1983 in East Germany, where he had lived after the war, and sentenced to life imprisonment. But he was released in 1997 for health reasons. He lived the rest of his life free in Germany, dying at the age of 90 without having fully served his sentence. Barth's case illustrates the persistent gap between formal justice and real justice regarding the crimes of the Second World War. Convictions occur, but they frequently arrive too late to be meaningful in terms of effective completion of the penalty. The accused are old when they reach trial. Sentences are reduced or suspended for health reasons. And the trials themselves, while important in symbolic terms and for the historical establishment of responsibilities, cannot undo the damage that was done. The last person brought to trial for the Oradour-sur-Glane massacre was Werner Christoph, whose case was investigated by German authorities in the 2010s. Christoph was Alsatian, one of the Malgrenus, and his case reactivated all the previous debates about the responsibility of forced conscripts. The process was eventually archived due to the health reasons of the accused, who was over 90 years old. There will be no more trials for Oradour-sur-Glane. The perpetrators who are still alive have died. Time has done what the courts could not always do. It has eliminated the physical perpetrators of the crime. What remains is history, memory, and the question of what it means for a society to live with crimes not fully resolved in terms of justice. There is an aspect of this history that has particular relevance for the contemporary world, and that I want to explore before concluding this second part: the question of how the memory of traumatic events is transmitted from one generation to the next. The last direct survivors of the Oradour-sur-Glane massacre have passed away. Robert Habrus died in February 2023. With him died the last voice capable of saying, "I was there." The transmission of memory has now passed entirely to generations who did not live through the events, who know them only through testimonies, books, films, visits to the memorial. This transition is critical because it changes the nature of memory. Living memory, sustained by direct witnesses, has an immediacy, an authenticity that mediated memory, transmitted through other vectors, cannot fully replicate. When the last survivor dies, the risk that the memory becomes diluted, distorted, or simply forgotten increases. Studies on the transmission of Holocaust memory have shown that this risk is real but not inevitable. Institutions dedicated to memory preservation, museums and memorials, educational programs, testimony archive projects, academic historical works, all these are instruments to counter forgetting, and in the case of Oradour-sur-Glane, these institutions exist and function. The Oradour-sur-Glane Memorial receives hundreds of thousands of visitors every year. The educational program that brings students from France and all of Europe to visit the ruins and learn history is one of the most active in the field of Second World War education. And the ruins themselves, preserved by government decree, are a form of architectural memory that resists forgetting in ways no narrative can do completely. But the transmission of memory also entails risks of another kind: the sacralization of history, its transformation from a complex and nuanced narrative into a simple and heroic or simply victimizing narrative. The history of Das Reich and Oradour-sur-Glane is extraordinarily complex. There are victims and perpetrators, but there are also the malgré who were both things at once. There is the resistance with its heroic actions and its tragic consequences for civilians. There is the Vichy government with its active collaboration. There is the international community with its tardiness in responding. Reducing that complexity to a simple story of good guys and bad guys is betraying history and depriving oneself of the most important lessons it offers. The best memory institutions, and the Oradour-sur-Glane Memorial is an example, try to preserve that complexity. They not only show what happened, but they try to explain why it happened, who the perpetrators were and what systems made them possible, and what the implications are for the present and the future. Those implications for the present are perhaps the most important aspect of this entire history for us today, because the 20th century demonstrated that mass atrocities are possible in advanced societies, in the heart of Europe, committed by ordinary people, and the 21st century has offered additional evidence that this possibility did not disappear with the end of the Second World War. The Rwandan genocide in 1994, ethnic cleansing in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, atrocities in Syria, in Myanmar, in Sudan. Each of these episodes has its historical and cultural particularities, but they all share with the history of Das Reich some fundamental elements: the dehumanization of the enemy, the institutional culture that sanctions violence, the impunity that makes it possible, and the complicity of those who could have stopped it and did not. The question of what makes people participate in mass atrocities is one of the most important that humanity can ask itself. And the answer offered by the history of Das Reich is disturbing in its implication that the answer lies not primarily in the exceptional evil of certain individuals, but in the systemic conditions that make it possible for ordinary people to commit extraordinarily evil acts. This is not an argument for moral relativism. It is not an excuse for the perpetrators. It's a diagnosis. If we want to prevent future atrocities, we need to understand their causes, and those causes are primarily systemic, ideological indoctrination that dehumanizes groups of people, institutional culture that rewards unconditional obedience, impunity that eliminates the cost of violence, gradual normalization of cruelty. And what can we do with that diagnosis? The answer offered by the most serious thinkers on this topic is neither simple nor comfortable. It requires constant vigilance. Vigilance against ideologies that divide humanity into categories of superior and inferior, against institutions that demand total obedience, with no room for individual conscience, against systems that concentrate power in a way that eliminates accountability. It also requires educating, especially the young, in an ethic that values the dignity of every person, regardless of their origin, their religion, their ethnicity, or their political position. An ethic that makes disobedience to unjust orders not only possible but mandatory. An ethic that recognizes that the responsibility to prevent evil does not rest solely with great leaders and great institutions, but with every person at every moment where they can make a difference. Das Reich committed its crimes because it was created to be able to commit them, because the system in which it existed made those crimes possible and sanctioned them, and because those who could have stopped it did not, whether out of complicity, cowardice, calculation, or simply indifference. The history of Das Reich is ultimately a story about the failure of humanity at that specific moment, but it is also a story that contains, in its cracks, evidence of resistance. The civilians who risked their lives to hide the persecuted, the soldiers in other contexts who refused to participate in massacres, the survivors who dedicated their lives to testifying, the historians and journalists who refused to let the comfort of forgetting win. Those voices of resistance and truth are the ones we must amplify, not as a compensation that neutralizes the horror, but as proof that even in the darkest conditions, human choice can go in another direction. The ruins of Oradour-sur-Glane still stand, the roofless walls, the rusted cars, the trams that never moved again, a village frozen in the moment of its destruction, a reminder that needs no words. And every time someone visits them, every time someone pauses before the names engraved on the memorial, every time someone wonders how this could happen and walks away with that question echoing in their mind, memory fulfills its most important function.